Dark Souls 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, and there were periods where I was so into it that I actually considered it my favorite game of all time, and not for lack of other options. I've played through the base game 7 times now and 5 through each DLC, with one of these runs being a Soul Level 1 run I finally mustered up the resilience to finish recently. We'll discuss that later on. I think Dark Souls 3 is far from perfect. Even as I'm writing this introduction, I feel like I have so much to criticize about the game that I could make it twice as good. But I still feel like it's almost perfect somehow, and I don't know why really. I could chalk it up to bias and continue with the critique, ending with these are the objective facts, but I won't do that, as I'm doing this critique just as much for you as I'm doing it for myself. I'll probably keep coming back to Dark Souls 3 until Soul Level 1 is not even a challenge anymore, so I need to finally get around to gathering my thoughts about it. Somewhat anyway. I'll admit it, I'm hyping up this question of why does Dark Souls 3 feel perfect even when we know it isn't way too much. But I still need a reason for you to sit through my 20,000 plus word commentary, so... Concerning spoilers, if you still haven't played the whole game, you probably shouldn't listen to these earlier segments. You can, however, skip to the commentary part, where I start discussing the starting area Cemetery of Ash, and simply stop when I get to the area you're currently in. I've made an effort not to spoil future areas while talking about the earlier ones just for that reason. I do tease some of them, but it's in a way that it will only make sense to those who finish the game. Before diving into the more complex issues of Dark Souls 3, I should probably get the minor criticisms out of the way. The sliders in the menu are painfully slow and have no reason to be. The port lists Xbox controls, which is just annoying. Even after playing it so much, I still confuse the controls in the menu sometimes. If anything, all the bright colors are just plain ugly. Concerning bugs, I sometimes run into these non-boss fog walls in front of Firelink Shrine in the Undead Settlement Tower. It's resolved with a simple exit to menu and logging back in. The problem is, the Great Tower once happened 2 times now and the Firelink Shrine about 4 I think. If it happens to a new player, this can be understandably confusing. Another bug is a visual one where you're wielding one weapon but actually using another, and it looks ridiculous. Imagine swinging around a greatsword with the moveset of a rapier. I don't even have footage of it or remember how it even happened, but it was only once, so it's not that bad. This is the final one I remember. Ironically, in a game criticized so much for being clunky, I never encountered any other bugs and I've played for 200 hours now. Also, you automatically take your secondary weapon out every time you travel at a bonfire, which is annoying as hell if you're carrying a grass crest shield for the stamina, but even worse if it's a Cestus or other pay shield as you probably won't even see it in the first place. Two-handing in this game is really weird and often useless. The Uchigatana, for example, when one-handed deals 195 damage. In comparison, two-handing it consumes 20% more stamina, deals 200 damage, and I'm almost sure that it's even slower, so yeah, this can be very confusing for a new player as well. Continuing, if you try to target something and it doesn't work, it resets your camera, which is something no one's ever actually used in the history of gaming, it just hurts your eyes. Even if you did want to use it, some might not, and they can't turn it off, they can only turn off the Y-axis for some unknown reason. Now the following might be just me, but I don't think I've ever played a game where I get cornered by a group of enemies or maybe just one enemy and can move and eventually die as much as I do in Dark Souls 3. And the final criticism is somewhat subjective. The game makes me feel like a bull in a china shop. Clothes fly out in all directions when you move, enemies' corpses behave like paper cutouts, everything breaks when you so much as breathe on it. On the other hand, it does contribute to how powerful the game actually makes you feel, but it's still a little too much in my opinion. It just looks goofy. Again, this is very subjective. However, if there are enough wooden chips and fragments piled in one place, they can start floating and glitching out at times, which is understandable, but we don't even need to be able to break everything, so yeah. On the other hand, a small criticism I'd like to actually refute is camera problems. Much like getting cornered, I can't recall a game where I've gotten so frustrated and confused with how little I'm seeing of what's actually going on. This isn't exclusive to cramped spaces either, as I remember it happening with the Sullivan Beast too, which you fight on top of an open bridge, or one of the bosses in the second DLC, which is in one of the biggest arenas in the whole game. But I don't think locking on is meant to be used all the time, it's mostly for the normal enemies and the smaller bosses. If most people actually tried not doing it, I think they'd even find it more comfortable, even if locking on did work as intended, which, let's be honest, it doesn't a lot of times. And I don't think most people would say it should be removed if it doesn't work on everything, or that it should be disabled from the boss it doesn't work on properly, as that's debatable and would get kind of messy. Difficulty is obviously a contested issue within the Dark Souls community. One of the biggest criticisms I've seen levied towards Dark Souls 3 is that it's too easy. Before diving into it, however, I should probably present my own experience. Dark Souls 3 was kind of really hard for me the first time around. It was one of the first actually hard games that I ever played, and although I've played a bunch of harder ones today, this is probably the one which took the most from my soul. Anyway, going back to is Dark Souls 3 too easy? This criticism is almost exclusively levied by Dark Souls veterans. I thought this was incredibly obvious, but I guess not. If you're playing the third or fourth installment of a series which only shifts a little in feel and mechanics, fifth installment if you count Bloodborne, and hundreds of hours of practice thanks to replays, it's only expected that it will get progressively easier, unless the games get significantly more challenging, of course. If you think they should be harder because of that, well, I disagree. The only case in which that would be fine with me is if the developers were sure the games in the series wouldn't be skipped, so say a story game, although these games usually aren't difficult, but you get the point. With Dark Souls, and especially Dark Souls 3, a huge majority of people will be skipping games, that's just the nature of it. A third and final installment of a series infamous for its difficulty will be coming out, one understandably more polished, graphically sound and modern than all the others. Do you honestly expect most people to go, oh I know, I should probably play Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 first? No, of course not. Lots of people will be jumping on the hype train to show how good they are at video games. Now if you think it should just be harder because of personal preference, that's obviously fine. Another question I should probably answer is, will it be okay if it was harder? This is answered in the same way, with the nature of how Dark Souls 3's community is. Most people that are playing it just won't have the nerve to deal with anything harder. The keyword here is deal. I think most people could beat it if they wanted to, but probably not before they rage quit. I mean hell, I almost rage quit in my first playthrough, and it wasn't on any of the hardest bosses from the DLCs or even the Soul Level 1 run. It was on Pontiff, and the reason was that I had gotten far enough into the game to reach the harder bosses, but not quite far enough to have learned how to deal with the anger. Most people don't really know how to deal with anger in games the first time they truly encounter it. On the other hand, today I would probably play a game as good as Dark Souls 3 even if the default experience was as hard as a Soul Level 1 run. Soul Level 1 is some of the most fun I've ever had in a game, but most people won't be able to handle it as their first truly rage-inducing experience. And I guess you could say that about any game, it's why I'm so torn on this issue. On one hand I want most people to actually enjoy the game like me and not rage quit, and on the other I really want to see how a game like that would play. If I had to take a stance though, it would probably be that we get a hard mode, that players are very incentivized to not play on their first try, very much incentivized not to. I mean, as it stands right now, we're okay, I guess. Not only the leveling system, but everything else like upgrading weapons, choosing weapons, rings and armor are all in and of themselves scaling difficulties. If you wanna take more damage, remove armor. If you wanna deal less, don't upgrade weapons or choose worse ones. On the contrary, a Soul Level 1 run does prohibit the use of some cool weapons, which would be fixed by an actual difficulty setting that allowed leveling. Also, it would probably feel way better to actually level up, choose the best weapon and use a creative try-hard build on a harder difficulty than to just be like, alright, I won't level, I guess, so the game becomes harder. Another criticism I've heard some people throw out is that the game is too short, and I don't think I can disagree more. One of the reasons might be Souls veterans once again. The game is obviously way longer if you die a lot, I thought that was pretty obvious as well. It took me around 40 hours to beat it the first time, I think. That's just the main game and all the optional areas, and the two bosses you'll be dying the most to are in the DLCs. But that might not actually be the reason, since even on consecutive playthroughs where I first time lots of bosses, the game still feels so unbelievably massive to me. I think the likelier reason is that individual levels are very small in this game, which is a criticism I'll happily throw out as well. I think it would have been better if we had a small number of bigger areas than lots of small ones, at least in Dark Souls 3, since a lot of areas here look the exact same, so we don't even achieve any great diversity in environments. That kind of contributes to even good areas feeling forgettable at times. The quality of most of the individual areas and bosses in Dark Souls 3 is what I believe the game executes best. When it comes to the world design of main areas, however, aka how they actually connect and feed into each other, they're more like a reverse stick bundle, or in other words, they work better when observed separately. The world design in Dark Souls 3 is hit and miss for me. On one hand, there are beautiful moments like walking up the stairs after defeating Wonir and seeing the entirety of the Boreal Valley and hoping you can explore all of it and having it turn out to actually be true. activating the giant mechanism and seeing Anor Londo unveil in front of you, or the way you can literally see the whole entire world from Vort's arena. But that's really it. I can't think of any other moment the game truly wowed me when it came to its world, and while discovering a new zone is always interesting, going through a linear journey through all of them is not. Dark Souls 3 feels more like a 2D Ghosts and Goblins game rather than a beautifully interconnected and complex 3D world. Thus, it doesn't really feel like a world as it should, it feels like your journey, which was made for you, by From Software. Thus, the world design is more of a miss rather than a hit. I have heard some people criticize Farron Shrine for being disconnected from the rest of the areas, and I have to disagree, as it has a very strict lore reason. The bright Farron Shrine we are in is from the future, while the dark one that exists in the real world is present. That's supported by the fact that if you talk to the handmaiden there before talking to the hub one, she will remember you, but the opposite isn't true. Going further, it simply wouldn't make sense to kill Gundyr than have him still be there in the Dark Shrine in the future. On the other hand, this is pretty much the only way you can go through the game, every single playthrough. You also have option areas like the Smouldering Lake, Untended Graves, Consumed King's Garden and Archdragon Peak of course, which could provide some variety in a playthrough, but we'll gauge that later after we take a look at them all. When it comes to main areas, you can choose to postpone Cathedral of the Deep and Anor Londo for a little bit while you're exploring the other ones, but you have to go to the Cathedral if you want to enter Irithyll, and you have to conquer Anor Londo if you want to venture to Lothric Castle, which are both things you'll be required to do a little after gaining access to said zones. So yeah, they're still just little deviations. Besides that, everything else is extremely linear, which is something I definitely don't like personally. Thus, when pondering the replayability of this Dark Souls game, the question isn't how many times can I think of playing the game in different ways, but rather how many times can I play the same thing over and over. It does have an upside, however, at least for some players. I don't know about you, but in Dark Souls 1 I found myself constantly thinking, what if I'm going to a boring area with a dumb boss first and then I'm too leveled by the time I actually find a good area and then just one-shot the good bosses, oh my god, where should I go, I don't know if this zone is worth it, should I Google the best first playthrough route experience? I have no idea what to do. At least you won't be worrying about that here. However, I don't think Dark Souls 3 would have suffered quite the same problem as almost every area is worthwhile here, and all the zones obviously wouldn't have been literally on the same soul level. Some are harder than others, some are still gated behind other zones, and so on. But going back to that question, how many times can I play the same thing over and over? The answer is, well, a lot. It just feels good to be good at something that is supposed to be very difficult, simple as that. And although it does get boring eventually, there's always different builds and challenges you can do, such as Soul Level 1. Even if you're doing the good old Dex or Strength build, it's still fun. I can't formulate just how good this game feels to play, you have to play it for yourself to understand. I know it looks clunky, but it plays really well. Another contributing factor is the level design, which is genuinely amazing. Everyone has that one favorite movie which they can watch endlessly with different friends every time, and always go, hey, there it is, oh, that's another memorable moment, or I bet you weren't expecting that. Well, Dark Souls 3 is that game for me. Almost, and I want to emphasize this very much, almost no level is ever a chore to traverse. And while it doesn't exactly get better every time, it stays just as consistent as the linearity of the game. Now is the time we should probably get into the thick of it. There are 4 things I want to say before diving into each of the individual areas. First of all, I feel the need to remind you just how much we usually expect from Souls games boss-wise. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, rather the opposite. It's a giant contributor, I think, to why some bosses in this game are as good as they are. Just try to keep in mind, when I'm criticizing a bunch of them, that what we classify as the bottom of the barrel worst bosses in Dark Souls 3 are on par and sometimes even better than what a lot of other games have to offer. We should also mention that even bad bosses almost always still feel good to fight in Dark Souls 3. Some people might say that fun dictates whether it's good or not, but I disagree. Even if they're bad, they're still fun to whack with a big sword, I think that goes without saying. If you put a target dummy in the middle of an area and made it do a spin attack every 3 seconds, I'd still have fun with it probably. The same goes for boring areas. As long as I don't actively hate something about it, I'll probably have fun traversing it and killing stuff. It has to be really bad to not be carried by Dark Souls 3's mechanics. On the other hand, bad enemies are almost always not fun, at least for me. It might be because they're way easier to screw up than bosses when designing, since with bosses you're really trying your hardest to design a good encounter. Or it might be as simple as we just have more fun beating up the big guy by default. I also need to say some things about Soul Level 1 as well, since I'll be mentioning it pretty often. Soul level 1 is a challenge where, you guessed it, you can't level. That's it really. The original reason I started this run was pretty much so I could boast about beating it, though I also eventually realized how good these runs are for studying a certain boss. If something feels unfair, you will remember it. Overall, you need to take way more time actually studying attacks, as you almost never get away with getting hit by something. You have to perfect it completely. However, I'll be lying if I said this challenge didn't also greatly skew my understanding of the difficulty in this game. I honestly don't remember what most bosses felt like before I did it. Just so you know, any bosses up until the Abyss Watchers I won't be discussing soul level 1 wise, as you obviously can't really feel the lack of stats yet, and they're really easy anyway. And finally, since I'll be discussing difficulty a lot, I should clarify the way I mostly play this game. I parry when I can, almost always use a grass crest shield for the stamina, and never block. I don't think blocking is cheating, but it does obviously make the game way easier, and I enjoy learning attack patterns and mastering the rolling anyway. I also almost never used magic until the recorded run you'll be seeing throughout this video. I don't think magic is cheating either, it can be easier at times, especially with non-boss enemies, sure, though I think it can tilt the odds in a boss's favor as well sometimes. From what I've seen and tried, I just don't enjoy magic that much. I almost always get bored with it, but that's just my problem, of course. We start off Dark Souls 3 by awakening within the Cemetery of Ash. Cemetery of Ash is pretty good as a starting area. You get introduced to the different types of enemies, melee, shielded and ranged. You already see a menacing enemy you can't beat yet and will be coming back to, unless you're stubborn of course and decide to take it on. You learn how to jump in order to access secrets, you learn plunge attacks and so on. After entering the arena and sheathing the sword from the statue's abdomen, it suddenly stands up, and now you're fighting it. Udex Gundyr is, to me, a really good first boss, both in design and difficulty, and also one who, and I know this might sound slightly elitist, is great for gatekeeping players who would otherwise not be able to play through the whole game. He has oddly yet not badly telegraphed attacks, he can be parried as well, which almost no one will be doing unless they're familiar with the Souls series or are playing Dark Souls 3 and want to get through him quickly. His introduction is amazing, he looks awesome, and his attacks are cool and terrifying. His second phase isn't that great though, it just feels off. I think FromSoft should have chilled with whatever this is. It does make the attacks even weirder looking and harder to dodge, but almost no enemies move in this way throughout the game, so I'm very surprised that this one does. While Cemetery of Ash is a good starting area, it isn't really a great area. It's very small and thus simply feels unfinished. Like I said, the size of this game does feel way grander whenever it's crossed with the game's difficulty, and thus turns a 10-hour game into a 40-hour one. However, this area is too small, and not hard at all anyway, even if it's your first Souls game. I think areas such as this are what leaves people with the impression that the game is too small. It's so forgettable, and while the boss is good, bosses should enhance the area, not define it. After making our way to Farling's shrine and conveniently teleporting to the next area, we get thrown onto the high wall of Lothric. This area seems fairly underwhelming at first, though you have to keep in mind that it's also the first real area of the entire game, so if anything, it throws a lot at you. Lothric Knights, Pus of Men and the Damn Wyvern are all pretty challenging enemies for a new player. I also love the big axe guys, who just look ridiculous. The level design here is also very creative, as the setting and atmosphere slowly shift while you're descending from the top of the wall to its base. At the beginning the area is vile and infested with mindless and horrific men, then you slowly transition to fighting decomposed Lothric Knights within their fair chambers, and finally reaching the beautifully kept goddess at the bottom, where you fight the most elite of knights. I can't explain how, but the descending looks natural, with all the stairs and towers you're going down. I didn't really notice how good this level design was, both as a level and art-wise the first time I played, and I honestly believe it's because of Dark Souls' bland color palette. A lot of stuff just looks the same in this game like I already said, but what can you expect, that's Dark Souls for you. By this time you've probably guessed it, it's time for another boss, Vort of the Boreal Valley. This one's introduction is truly outstanding, I gotta say. He looks horrifying, the soundtrack is grand, all of this really got my hopes up for the entire game. If the first area is this damn good, then what else does the game have to offer? And yet, all of his grandness is ultimately ironic for one of the easiest bosses in the entire game. The only time I can recall dying to him is 2 times when I was still learning the game, and maybe if I had simply taken too much time killing every single mob up until him and had like 10% HP left and no Estus flasks. I do enjoy beating him up, but that's any boss for me really, like I said. If you get under him, he doesn't do any special attack in order to force you to stand in front of him, they simply extended his attacks as hitboxes to somehow reach there in times where they shouldn't. He is overall a disappointment to the rest of the area. Another disappointment is the elevator for Vort. I know, but just hear me out, okay? This shortcut lets you go back to your first bonfire, and that's it. You'll never use it for anything else ever. I conducted some tests which, albeit not completely accurate to the last millisecond, still show some oddity in this particular shortcut. It takes 52 seconds to run from the Lothric Castle bonfire, use the shortcut and run to the Vort one. That's with jumping off the elevator and taking a little bit of damage and not bringing it back up for the next time. From the tower on the wall one, it takes 1 minute and 2 seconds, and on top of that you get souls from the undead who fall to their death as you're climbing down the ladder. On my adventure to find the most optimal route to Vort, they also never managed to hit me once, let alone push me down, seeing as they don't even finish scaling the wall by the time you're on the ladder. You can also opt for jumping off the roof instead, which reduces it to 53 seconds and deals a very little amount of damage. You don't get souls though. Now you can say that the shortcut is safer, however, there's also the chance of forgetting to send the elevator back up and thus having to wait, or maybe even falling down. Don't pretend like that doesn't happen every once in a while. This shortcut is just slightly better, if not on par with the roof jump method, but it's such a small difference, and since you won't be dying much to Vort, it makes it feel completely unnecessary from a gameplay point of view. From a world building one though, it's quite nice. It makes it feel like this is actually a place and not some level made for you to traverse. But I think these aren't mutually exclusive, having a realistic elevator that you can imagine the inhabitants of the world use, while also making it actually viable for you. It's fine to have an elevator for just a world building reason, but when you try to have it both ways, you need to make it an actual shortcut. Anyway, next area. After descending down the wall, a pack of winged monsters carry you to a small dilapidated bridge. A big door opens and a herd of rabid dogs get released and ravage the undead that are begging to be let through the gate. This area is called the Undead Settlement, a rundown village infested with, well, guessed it, a variety of friendly undead. You descended so far down that you are now in a place even worse than the top of the wall. The idea of this place is genuinely another great one, though I feel the need to mention that it once again suffers from Dark Souls 3's lack of color variety. Otherwise, it's a great area with absolutely amazing level design, literally everything looks back in on itself. It actually feels like a town and not a place you are meant to traverse. The majority of the area also has just one bonfire, with a really cool and actually useful shortcut next to it. Although in the beginning of the area we have Vort's bonfire, then after we get carried down there's another bonfire, and then behind the door you can see from up there we have another bonfire. The enemies here get way wilder than Lothric walls as well. Thralls, hollow manservants, evangelists, giant rats, these workers who are straight out of Bloodborne, and so on. The visual design of Dark Souls 3's enemies is just the best. You also have the big tower from where a giant archer shoots down on the undead. If you get to the tower you meet Sigurd of Katarina, who can't quite figure out how to reach the top, seeing as the elevator only goes down. If you do go down however, you find him nowhere in sight when you get back up again. If you manage to figure it out, you'll realize you're supposed to send the elevator down, get off of it, and then get back up on the new one which leads to the top. Very nice and simple way to teach the player to look out for that kind of thing. You can then choose to make peace with the giant and his arrows won't harm you anymore. This elevator also teaches the last common mechanic across elevators, which is jumping off of it while it's descending. If you do so, you find Sigurd pondering how to approach the giant demon on the horizon, and of course you charge head first and kill him, as he's quite the easy mini-boss. Under the tower you find an Outrider Knight guarding the next bonfire. I really like these enemies, they're basically supposed to be a small version of Vort, though their weapons, attacks and pretty much everything differs a lot. After defeating this one, or more likely running past him and then giving it a try, you reach the next zone. But that's not everything this area has to offer. You may have ran across a giant arena where a bunch of ordinary undead are praying to a giant tree. If you get closer, the tree, or rather the curse-rotted greatwood, stands up. That completely took me off guard, I'll be honest. The boss looks, moves and sounds disgusting and vile, just as intended. However, what are at first enemies placed there for deception and lore reasons quickly become beacons for artificial difficulty. They just don't need to be there. Any boss would become harder if you put some dumbass enemies everywhere, but that doesn't mean it will become more challenging. But even if you get rid of them, the fight still sucks. It would have simply benefited from a greater array of deadlier, harder to dodge attacks, and an argument such as the boss is too big to work, most other good bosses are always smaller, don't really work, since one of the best, if not the best boss in the game for some people is way bigger than this one. Also, do you remember the way the camera zoomed out after the Vord fight? I think this fight would have greatly benefited from that. The Great Wood's attacks are so obviously telegraphed, but you can't see them because you're looking down at his... Anyway, the boss is kinda fun to fight in a moment, as hitting his sacks is just so satisfying for some reason, but it's incredibly forgettable. Undead Settlement, on the other hand, is one of the best designed and most memorable areas in the entire game. It just has such an expansive array of unique enemies. But it's sadly also let down by not only an easy, but this time an outright bad boss fight. Anyway, the next zone we'll be embarking upon is the Road of Sacrifices. I'd like to say this is another great area, but it's just okay. The layout is actually not bad, it's basically a short road which leads to a swamp, which then takes you to a small fortress thingy. It works really well. It also has, yet again, very weird bonfires. The Road of Sacrifices one, the one in the beginning, and the Crucifixion Woods one, the one in the middle of the swamp, are perfectly spaced out. And yet they felt the need to add the one in the middle, ironically named Halfway Fortress. This area feels really small, too small even, and I think the more bonfires are what contribute to that feel. The swamp also has lots of what feel like filler enemies to me. I know it's supposed to be like, wow, this area is infested with so many little crabs and poison mushroom things, but when they don't do anything, what's the point really? It also has the giant crabs, which are some of the most unique enemies in the whole game and probably the only one which I never fought on my first playthroughs because they look so scary. And that's with the fact that they do come up a lot later, which is fine by the way, because I like them. In the Ruined Fortress you find the Crystal Sage. He is the best example of a very weird phenomenon with this game, wherein the better you get, the easier the hard bosses become, obviously, but also the harder the easy bosses get, somehow. I think I actually died more on some of my later playthroughs than I did on my first one. This is the last boss I think of if somebody pointed a gun to my head and told me to choose the boss to beat on the first try. You can chalk it up to I die on the hardest bosses a lot so I learn them, on the easy ones never so I don't even need to learn them, and on this one a couple of times a run so I never learn it, but I never first time it either. But I don't think so. He's so incredibly random and unpredictable, it's like he throws everything you think you know out the window. I do like him though, he forces you to observe your surroundings very carefully, but at times it can feel like if he wants you to die, you just have to die and accept it. There isn't much you can do really if 10 projectiles are coming at you from all directions, and they're also perfectly timed so as to not leave you a single frame of safety. This is one of the bosses you can just tank every time and never bother to actually learn, but he's okay. Also, why does he reappear for a split second every single time he transitions to his second stage? I really wanna know. Overall, the Road of Sacrifice is a good area, but definitely on the more forgettable side for me. The next one, on the other hand, the Cathedral of the Deep, is one of my favorites in the whole game. Firstly, the beginning once again continues the trend of bad bonfires. We have Crystal Sage, Cathedral of the Deep, and Cleansing Chapel. The Cathedral of the Deep one is literally not needed. Luckily, this isn't a trend in the level, as it's another one of the most well-designed ones. You're going around this giant cathedral, fighting for your life as you're trying to find a way in, and after finally finding the entrance, you go up an elevator and are back at the chapel bonfire. It surprised me a lot, especially since I didn't even see the big doors before. It also feels so far away, even though it's perfectly fair and I get it on the first try most of the time anyway. I just love this so much, these levels where you have one bonfire for the majority of the area, like back in Undead Settlement. Here we also have that theme of the lower you go, the worse it gets. At the bottom you can find these maggot monstrosities which seem like the most bullshit enemies in the world with their never-ending bleed build-up, until you realize that the torch cures it immediately. Then there are the Cathedral Grave Wardens, which are some of the coolest enemies in the whole game. I really wish they had used them more than 3 times here, and I think 2 times in another completely optional area. Some enemies can be met in more than 5 areas, which makes me wonder why they never use these as much. I also love the Cathedral Knights. This is probably the first enemy which really pushes the idea of how beneficial parrying can actually be, which I love. Exploring the inside, you find a giant spider, or a Deep Accursed. Honestly not my favorite enemy to fight, but they do look horrifying and have quite the intriguing backstory related to Aldrich. I think he shared his appetite for flesh with them, which is what eventually turned them to these things. Of course, the enemies which stand out the most here are the Giant. This is the first time you meet them. These guys have enormous HP pools, but they drop a large Titanite shard, which is something you'll get lots of later in the game. They can still give you a little boost now. But then again, if you manage to kill them, you probably don't even need it. You know what, I'm thinking about it too hard. Their attacks are also almost impossible to dodge. You have to perform an unbelievably precise roll, invisibility frame wise. There's a hallway you can enter on the left of the cathedral where you find an elevator. It leads you to this undead marksman sniping spot. And that's it. There's nothing here. Nothing shiny or a chest or anything, and I love this. It really fleshes out this place as, well, an actual place. Down the hallway you also find another shortcut to the cathedral bonfire, which I did find odd at first. Why are there two shortcuts for the same boss? That's because the first one is not for the boss, it's for exploring the whole inside of the cathedral, and the second one you find will be used for the boss. The second is also a 1-minute walk to the said boss, while the other one is 140 and way more dangerous because of the giants. Speaking of bosses, we have the Deacons of the Deep. The Deacons are a boss I've heard lots of people describe as a good idea with bad execution. But I disagree, I think it's a bad idea too. It sounds like a good idea, but it really isn't. Just throw in a bunch of weak motherfuckers in there, have them mow them down, that'll be fun. At least they look cool, I guess. I think they're meant to be satisfying, but they aren't even that to me. Crystal Sage and Great Wood aren't great, yet they're satisfying. This isn't, so repeat it with me once again, it somewhat ruins the amazing area. The next area, Farron Keep, can be accessed from the swamp in Road of Sacrifices once again, and it's another swamp. I'm pretty torn on this area, but I'd be lying to you if I said I enjoyed it even one bit. The idea is you need to find and extinguish 3 flames in order to open the big door, but there's a catch. You might die several times while doing so. I actually love this idea, but its execution not so much. You see, the reason this area is so hard is not because of the enemies along the way like Cathedral of the Deep or Irithyll, one of the later areas. And it's not even because of the fact that it poisons you, it barely deals any damage. The real reason is it's so fucking confusing, and not in a good way. Everything just looks the same, which is bad in and of itself and something already common across the board in this game. The only thing which makes me barely remember this area is that I can't forget how much I hate it. This isn't even because I die a lot in it, it's usually one time at most, it's just such a chore to traverse and I never look forward to it. The enemies are also incredibly forgettable, especially since you're just running past all of them. An exception would be the Elder Gru, these giant tree-holding guys. I wish they used these in some more bearable conditions. I really love the direction they took with them visually. And of course the Gru Leapers, which you kind of have to fight as they're chasing you all the time. I love how wild these guys are, and they do come up one more time, but it's sadly in an even more confusing and terrible small sub-area, which I'm dreading to even discuss. The boss in Farron Keep, on the other hand, the Abyss Watchers, is one of my favorites in the entire game, including DLCs. And it's the only reason for this zone not being my least favorite. Everything for their models, to their attacks, to the cutscene at the beginning of the first and second phase looks so phenomenal. Their lore is amazing, the soundtrack is gloomy and matches the fight perfectly. It's honestly the most unique idea I've ever seen in a boss fight in any game really. This encounter also made me realize that fighting multiple bosses at once isn't necessarily a bad thing, but most often just executed poorly. And by poorly I mean not pulling any twist on it and just throwing you into an arena with 2 of the same enemies, who then do their attacks, which overlap. Here they simply give you a personal Abyss Watcher buddy to help you out, which allows for these really cool situations where you set it up so you wreck the fake Abyss Watcher and then help the friendly one in defeating the real boss. If they had just put 2 Abyss Watchers, I probably would have hated the fight. The second phase on the other hand is when it gets real. The boss's sword lights on fire, so you now have to look out for the trails it leaves, which look beautiful by the way. The fight is incredibly tight too, with him never leaving you even a second to heal unless you manage to evade one of his longer attacks. His moveset becomes larger and more difficult to pin down, which I love, and while I think his flip does look amazing, he spams it too often. It leaves him open too many times and does make the fight kind of easy. Too easy in fact, which takes away from how awesome it is. Don't get me wrong, it's the first slight challenge in the game and will definitely take a while for most players to beat. It shouldn't simply be made harder, but made harder and also put later in the game, when most players would have gotten a better feel for how things work. Later in the game you also have way more Estus flasks and a larger stamina bar, which allows for more complex and challenging prolonged fights. This boss is also the first really good one up until now, and it honestly made me re-examine my position on how I felt about the majority of the bad bosses being earlier in the game. Originally I thought it was a bad feature, since some people might get the wrong idea and quit, and I still kind of do. But it's the better option, as we're kind of getting them out of the way and leaving the others with more potential to flourish the most they can in the late game. Thus, the Abyss Watchers being so early just feels like wasted potential is all, and although you could say that not all of the good bosses should be in the late game, which I would probably agree with, this isn't just a good boss, it's probably in my top 5, including DLCs, and it wouldn't baffle me if someone said it was their favorite from the base game, and maybe even including the DLCs as well. Concerning Soul Level 1, I believe I died once or twice. The next level you can embark on after defeating the Abyss Watchers is not one of my favorites. In fact, I'd probably say that the Catacombs of Carthus are my least favorite from the mandatory ones in Dark Souls 3. You might notice the enemies here move in a very unnatural way, which is definitely intended. I mean, they're freaking skeletons. It's a very nice way to give the enemies harder to dodge, confusingly telegraphed attacks and not deviate from realism. It's not like, why does this knight do a triple spin flip into a raw instant stab instead of just fighting normally? It's, they're skeletons, of course they're weird. However, they also get up once again after you kill them, which is something I frankly hate. From a visual standpoint, this is a very bland area as well. We have skulls and death everywhere in this game, and an area with just that is nothing but boring. Every single hallway looks the exact same, and while it's not confusing like Farron Keep, it's still not good. One of the traps here is a pressure plate which sends arrows your way, and it's possibly the easiest to avoid trap and the most useless one I've ever seen. It doesn't even deal that much damage. The rolling ball of skeletons on the other hand is a really nice touch and can actually be dangerous at times. After emerging into a big cave, you get to open an ice gate which acts as a shortcut, then run across a bridge while a horde of skeletons is following you. And if you're smart enough to break the bridge, you'll manage to escape. Of course, if you don't, then they'll simply leave you alone anyway, since they can't enter the final room with you. I honestly don't think this area could have been executed that much better visually. If we had more colors, we'd deviate from the grey catacombs theme, but that theme is simply boring to me. We also get almost no catacombs here in fact, which could have allowed for some creative level design I feel. A lot of areas in this game just give you a sneak peek at an idea and leave it at that, and this is frankly one of the most annoying cases. Going back to the final room. After touching the single goblet in the middle, you get transported to a dark area with a single shiny item. This is one of the coolest reveals in the whole game, and it really hyped this boss up for me, though it's ultimately a letdown once again, since the boss kind of sucks. You have to destroy all 3 of his bracelets, which would be a cool concept if it also had something interesting to prevent you from doing that. The only thing he has is this death fog, which insta-kills you if, well, he wants it to happen. If he decides, he just stays in the fog, you see, that's it. Especially his dumb right arm, which is always a little behind. I don't think he has a single attack which actually stands out. He also pulls you back with them in a non-scripted way, which I just hate so much. He proceeds to spawn mobs if you take too long, which seems like a good punishment, but like I said, if he wants, he just stays in the fog. Besides, extra mobs is, like I said, bullshit to me. I also can't see anything here, and yet the reason for this boss not being something I look forward to is not that it's a giant scary skeleton, but that he's just annoying. It's yet another bad boss that isn't even satisfying. He was pretty hard on soul level 1 in fact, although it's understandable as I had no damage to beat him in time and died to the fog, which is what happens if you're usually slow. It's one of the cases where the game is just not intended for soul level 1. After defeating Wonir, you open the big door behind him and see this. That's Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. What proceeds is frankly the best area in the whole game, including DLCs, including optional content, just everything. It's so great. For a start, we should probably comment on what stands out the most. That is, how much the area stands out. It's definitely the brightest one in the whole game, and also, without question, the most beautiful. It reminds me of Sekiro's diverse environments of all things, which is something I wish in a way Dark Souls 3 had gone with. Of course, we can't start a great area without some questionable bonfires. Okay, we have this one here. Oh, there's another one. Nice, I haven't had one in a while. It's likely this is because the developers thought the Sullivan Beast would be way harder than it actually ended up being. It still looks horrifying though, it makes me wish it were a full fleshed out boss fight actually. The real level begins after it, however. It's still easy to see why I started raging so much at this part of the game. The Pontiff Knights and the Fire Witches are really up there as the enemies which still get the biggest amount of hits on me even today on my playthroughs. The Fire Witches are not that difficult on their own, but they are when they're surrounded by 4 undead bodyguards. I honestly wish FromSoft had just reskinned them, given them a bunch of more attacks and put them later in the game. They're great. The Pontiff Knights on the other hand are just plain difficult to deal with. I love how long their combos are. They're like little pontiffs, I guess that's what they're supposed to be, and don't ask who that is. I know these are lore related to Irithyll, but I also wish we had seen more of them. They're really fun to fight. After making your way through what feels like a sea of these, but is really like 2 Fire Witches and 5 Pontiff Knights, you arrive at the Church of Yorshka bonfire. The next venture is what makes this area so memorable for me. First you exit the church, then enter a big dark room where you constantly try not to fall or get pushed off the railings by the invisible undead. Then you descend into a disgusting spider-infested swamp where you might get ambushed by the Sullivan Beast once again if you decided to skip it. I really love the contrast of this area compared to the beautiful bright colors of Irithyll. Then you enter to the sewers of all places, which are full of even more spiders, and afterwards you emerge into a luxurious room housing some Silver Knights. Can we just admire how great the scenery of this shot is? Finally, you make your last death march, literally, as hordes of dogs are chasing, or rather teleporting behind you, with multiple invisible sorcerers firing at you at the same time, and if you die, it's back at the church again. After that, you hopefully find your way to the fog wall, near which is the door that blocked you off before, and once opening it, you are again back to the same bonfire. This is probably the best instance of the circular long journey to find the shortcut to the bonfire you started at, since it's just an unforgiving, grueling one for a new player. However, I did make it harder on myself in 2 ways. One of them is not noticing the elevator shortcut along the way. Granted, it's very close to the finish line and is overall useless, but still. More importantly though, I didn't light the bonfire halfway through the journey, which can be found on the end of the swamp. It's for another area you'll be venturing into later. I honestly don't think this bonfire should be here. In fact, they should have put some mini-boss like the Sullivan Beast or the Deep Accursed in front of the entrance to the area just so players are discouraged from going there for now. It just made my trek to the end so much harder without that bonfire, and ultimately much more memorable. And I don't think most people would mind going there from the church again later in order to access that area. 2 minutes really isn't much in the dozens of hours it will take you to beat this game the first time. While this level is sort of linear, as in you're going in one direction most of the time, it still manages to feel like a real, living, breathing city. You change directions and environments a lot, which makes it seem as if you're actually going through different parts of the city, even if it is just one trek till the end. You might be wondering what stands behind that fog wall, and I don't blame you. After traversing it, you see this, just absolutely gorgeous arena. And in the middle of it all stands Pontiff Sullivan. Pontiff is definitely the boss most full of surprises in the entire game. You hear the calm music and see him slowly walking towards you just to have him leap across the whole arena and smack you in the head. He does these long, masterful combos that take your entire stamina pool and more to dodge. Almost all of his attacks are very sudden too, with no wind up, which makes it really hard in the beginning, but if you stand back and observe them and manage to memorize them all, you can know when to dodge before you even see them come. There are other bosses that do this too, but this is the first one, so I'm gonna address it here. I don't think every boss needs to be beatable on the first couple of tries before you know their attacks. I think this is more a matter of opinion, but I'll try and talk about it objectively. While I can definitely see why people might be annoyed by such a thing, I think it definitely allows for some more complex fights and ones which can be truly mastered, completely. It reminds me of a certain dancer or a dragon from the second DLC. Still, those hard to dodge attacks mean that you not only need to dodge perfectly, but also manage your stamina perfectly. You can't even get all the hits you want on him, most often just one. This element of surprise is even further elevated by the fact that this is also the first real hard fight in the game. I know I said that about the Abyss Watchers, but scratch that. Now the tutorial is over. This is the first real challenge. Anyway, then there's his second phase, which seems okay until you realize that now there's two of them? This is another great example of the two bosses idea done right, as you aren't really fighting the same enemy, but the same enemy 2 times in a row. Literally, they're doing the same attacks. Luckily, these attacks are mostly way slower and shorter, so don't worry, you don't need to dodge 2 10-hit combos at the same time. And when you get better at the game, you realize you can parry the boss too, which makes things even more interesting for a replay. I'd say this boss is my second favorite from the base game. And also another boss I had mastered by the time I began Soul Level 1, so I beat him in no more than 5 tries. I died on him the most in my first playthrough in the base game though, and almost rage quit Dark Souls 3 forever. I'm not even joking. I actually tried to delete the game, you see, but ended up deleting a different folder and had calmed down by the time I realized it, so yeah, this video might not have happened. A contributing factor to this might have been that I had a terrible build though. After Pontiff, we make our way up to this spinning machine, facing a bunch of Silver Knight archers along the way, which are some of the coolest and sometimes most frustrating enemies in the entire game. You can also activate the small elevator in Pontiff's room to use it as a shortcut? This just makes no sense. It takes 1 minute and 4 seconds to get to the big spiral machine thingy from that shortcut. The normal route on the other hand takes 1 minute and 14 seconds. That's almost no difference, and this shortcut is never going to be used, like ever. There's a bonfire right after the big machine thing, and this isn't even a place you'll be returning to even once. They even went out of their way to put a door here, so it's even more optimal. But optimal for what? I genuinely don't understand, so maybe someone could explain it in the comments. Maybe it's a PvP thing, I have no idea. After using the big machine, it takes you here. Yup, it's Anor Londo. Technically, this is a different zone altogether, even though there's almost nothing to explore here, so I kind of want to count it towards Irithyll since it's so beautiful. But I wouldn't, even if I could, because the boss that resides here is one of the more disappointing ones. Aldrich, Devourer of Gods, another one of the Lords of Cinder. He has not a single memorable attack, besides maybe the arrow volley, but just maybe. He's also too easy. He has some of the most weirdly telegraphed attacks in the whole game, and not in any how am I supposed to dodge this kind of way, but rather how am I supposed to get hit by this, which is frankly even worse. You could say, oh, Aldrich is controlling Gwendolyn, and Aldrich isn't even human anymore, so he doesn't know how they're supposed to move or look like, or he's having trouble controlling him. No. Anyway, he sometimes also just straight up vanishes without doing anything, which stretches the easy fight over minutes and minutes. However, he was very fun on Soul Level 1. It took me a couple of hours, I believe. I remember having to constantly dodge his magical attacks, ones I didn't even recognize on normal playthroughs, as I would simply rush and beat the shit out of him every single time. But that's on Soul Level 1, of course. In the base game, however, he's a disappointment to the Lords of Cinder. I think they could have simply given him way more magical attacks, and deadlier ones too. I kind of had the same complaint with the Crystal Sage, that he didn't have enough cool, unique magical attacks. But I didn't mention it since he's just one of the first bosses. But I think it would have really been cool to have a Master Sorcerer challenging Lord of Cinder boss. The following zones, Irithyll Dungeon and the Profaned Capital, are technically two separate zones, but they're kinda small, especially the Profaned Capital. They're also one after the other, and only the latter has a boss, so I've always considered them one and the same in my book. Irithyll dungeon can be entered near the big swamp on the base of the Irithyll bridge. It makes me wonder why the entrance to this place is actually here lore-wise. I was left with the impression that this was supposed to be the decayed place where nobody from Irithyll went, or at least it looks like that, but I might be totally wrong. Anyway, I really enjoyed the Irithyll dungeon. I love how ugly it looks at first glance in comparison to Irithyll itself. It's a shame we only get to see, I believe, 2 blocks of the prisons here. This place could have been one of the more interesting labyrinths to traverse, but it's good enough as it is. The jailers are especially interesting. Their stare gradually lowers your max HP for a short while and can leave you with almost none of it. It's what makes this attack of theirs so terrifying, the one where they bump and stagger you, which deals almost nothing, but then, if you don't throw fast enough or move out, they do it again and deal a lot more. This area also has not one, but the 2 most memorable and terrifying moments in the whole game. Well, the first one is kind of scary. You pick up this shiny item from a corpse and it shrieks loudly, which can understandably scare someone if their headphones are loud. The second moment, on the other hand, was much more terrifying for me. At one point you enter this jail cell and see a disturbingly deformed, baby-like creature hanging from the ceiling in the corner. It just stands there and stares at you without doing anything. It doesn't even retaliate if you attack it. Later though, you see another one with a shiny item inside its room. You likely try to pick it up quickly, especially since you're worried about the jailer behind you. But when your camera zooms in as you enter the cramped room, the monster jumps straight at you and starts attacking you. I think I actually screamed out loud the first time I saw this and was distraught for like the next minute. But back to Irithyll dungeon. I think they could have put some very intriguing specimens in these jail cells. I'm talking about some NPC fights or maybe a bunch of friendly NPCs even. They could have had some cool backstories on how they ended up in this jail in their item descriptions or their dialogue. After walking through some sewers and finally getting out of the jail, we arrive at the Profaned capital. In terms of how much time you will be exploring, this area is almost on par with Anor Londo and Consumed King's Garden. And while I don't actively hate the zone, it's easily the most boring one in the entire game. I have nothing good nor bad to say about it, it's really that disappointing and empty. Speaking of that, we have a Lord of Cinder even more disappointing than this area, Yorm the Giant. He not only bears the crown for being the most disappointing Lord of Cinder, but also the biggest letdown in the entire game altogether. I gotta give it to FromSoft for creating the encounter with the biggest amount of wow factor to difficulty / boss design quality and complexity ratio. You pick up this sword from his throne, charge it up and shoot him 5 or 4 times with it. It wasn't enough to give us another big boss with a shitty one-shot mechanic, he also has to look phenomenal and literally be one of the most important bosses lore-wise in the entire game, so as to have us be let down even more. It isn't fun at all either, even slightly. Concerning soul level 1, I mean, there's no difference really. You hit him once, charge it while he's standing up, then do it again until he's dead. I don't want to talk about this boss anymore, so that's that. Luckily, something actually interesting happens then. After slaying the 3 Lords of Cinder, you get transported to a very unlikely location, Emma's room, the one perpendicular to that of Void back in High Wall of Lothric. I'm very glad we're back in this area for what proceeds, as it is simply a phenomenal fight, one with the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. She is one of Pontiff's twisted monstrosities, wielding 2 curved swords much resembling those of Sullivan's, one light and one dark. She moves on one hand like an elegant dancer and on the other in a very beastly, unpredictable manner. I know I truly love a boss's design when it makes me construct sentences like that. Her moveset is a little challenging at first, but it never ever feels unfair once you know what to look out for. And even though it took me around 3 tries to get her the first time, Soul Level 1 was another story. The Dancer was the absolute hardest boss for me in the base game and the first DLC on Soul Level 1. I spent maybe 7 hours of my 40-hour playthrough here. You see, that's because the Dancer is a very challenging boss, but also because she's inconveniently placed in the part where you have the lowest number of upgrades on your weapon in comparison to how much health the bosses have. I honestly don't quite remember exactly what it was like, but it can't have been more than a +7 broadsword. And a +7 broadsword doesn't deal a lot of damage. And though it was absolutely excruciating, I'm very happy that this is the boss I got to spend so much time with. If I had to describe the Dancer fight with one phrase, it'd be high risk, high reward. Her moves are sometimes impossible to roll through. If you manage to dodge one of her attacks though, it's baffling how many times you can hit her. Sometimes she just walks around you and you get 5 hits in, and that's with being cautious of her next attack and not just spamming left mouse button and running out of stamina. The fact that this fight is, I guess you could say, unfair to your skill, as in it isn't really impossible to dodge her attacks, just really hard, and it is also extremely fair in regards to how much you can get away with, makes it an ultimately fair fight, yet in a very nerve-wracking way. After defeating her, you finally enter Lothric Castle, and for all the build-up, I find this area quite disappointing. It's pretty small, much like with other small zones. The likely reason is there's too many checkpoints. You have the Dancer of the Boreal Valley one right before the zone, and then the Lothric Castle one seconds later, then the Dragon Barracks one a little after that. I think this zone is small enough to have greatly benefited from not having the Lothric Castle one. That's not the most disappointing thing though. It's in fact the lack of variety in enemies and scenery. I don't think this area introduces anything new. I was expecting to meet the absolute elite of the elite guards of Lothric Castle and to see the beautiful structures here. Yet it's just high wall of Lothric with extra steps. Which does make sense lore-wise, I guess, but still. This area doesn't stand out in the slightest to me, and is one of the areas I almost never look forward to exploring. The boss of this area is Dragonslayer Armor, who I don't have much bad to say about, but not an overwhelming amount of good either. He's one of the bosses that's just okay in my book. He has some interesting attacks such as the charge overhead slam, the big slash or the shield slam, but not much else. He feels bland in that way, although his visual design is very well done and makes him feel way more powerful than he actually is. On Soul level 1 I maybe had around 15 tries at him. The only problem were the butterflies really, who shoot at you throughout the encounter. I actually like them, they add another layer to the fight, but not in some throw extra enemies in their bullshit way. It's once again just not made for Soul level 1, as they're designed to deal extra damage and slightly stagger, not one-shot you. I'd say I'm glad this boss is in the game, but I'm never ecstatic to fight him really. After defeating the Dragonslayer armor, you gain access to the Grand Archives. But before venturing there, I feel the need to address this bonfire placement here. I know it's been said millions of times, but this is the worst one in the whole game. I don't think I need to say more really. The Grand Archives is one of the smaller areas in the game. You can get through it in 30 minutes if you're really taking your time and even die once or twice. This criticism comes from the fact that I like this area so much. I think it has a lot of potential and definitely should have been expanded upon further. It has amazing level design and opportunities for great shortcuts such as this bookcase you can lower. This area is the worst case of that sneak peek in the base game. I really love the atmosphere here and was very disappointed we saw so little of it. Here we have the mini-boss Crystal Sage, who honestly works better like this than as an actual boss. He's the thing that'll snipe you from different directions the whole time, even though he can't get close to hitting you half the time. If you have a decent weapon, you'll likely kill him the second time you get to him. There's also the Lothric Knights, which are great enemies and quite challenging, but you can only face them so many times before you eventually figure them out. After exiting the archives, you run into these 3 assholes and promptly skip them in order to unlock the shortcut next to the first bonfire. I guess the one plus we have from the area being as small as it is that we also have just one bonfire. After getting your well-deserved checkpoint, you run through the army of Lothric Knights. The attention to detail here is great, as the more elite knights are positioned closer to the building. We are past this, but might I add how much I also love this moment here where you get to go on a little roof and gaze at the view. There's no item here or an enemy, but there doesn't have to be. Both of these details contribute to the archives feeling like a real place. Finally, before venturing into the giant building, you can go right and unlock another shortcut, one which leads to the Dragonslayer bonfire through the little chapel. I really like this shortcut and it will definitely be useful for what follows, but it defeats the purpose of the last one. I think this area would have been better off without that first shortcut, since all it does is make you spend less time here as it gives you an unnecessary checkpoint. God forbid I need to spend 2 more minutes running through this 30-minute area. Besides, these enemies here are for show, really, they don't do much. But that's not that big of a problem, because this area's boss is another very great one. The twin princes, Lorien and Lothric. They are one of the most badass and, if you know the lore, disturbing bosses. Well, rather boss, because this fight is more about Lorien than it is about Lothric, ironically. Lorien is an amazingly well visually designed boss. I don't know how FromSoft are so good at making the humanoid bosses move and act like the most beastly ones, but it works very well. Soundtrack is also incredible, though that goes without mention in this game.
Now have your rest.
The Twin Princes are a very unique fight thanks to Lorien's teleportation capabilities. Seeing as his attacks are very well telegraphed, there has to be something extra on top of that, and the teleport delivers that well. He often starts his attack before you've even seen him. He can also teleport mid-combo, which does sound even scarier than the normal teleports and would be a very nice addition indeed, if it actually mattered. If anything, I think it makes it easier in fact, since you can literally brace for an attack that's supposed to be in the middle of a combo. And the types of attacks sandwiched in between long combos are naturally easier to dodge than the starting/ending attack of a combo or just a single attack. There's also this weird bug with teleportation where if he falls on top of one of the breakable chairs, he stops completely and whatever special attack he set out to perform will not be done. The hardest thing in this fight is not getting greedy. If you were to just dodge and hit once, at least the first phase would be incredibly easy. But there's something about dodging these powerful and menacing looking attacks that make me think I'm safe to do my thing for like 4 seconds. But no, Lorien just moves into another one of his attacks the next second. The second phase is when Lothric comes in. He pretty much does nothing attack wise. One of his attacks is an easy to dodge projectile and the other is a bunch of floating orbs he spawns in the air, which should pose no threat except on Soul level 1, where they're absolutely horrendous to deal with. I remember dying no more than I think about 25 tries on Soul level 1 by the way. The real threat Lothric poses is that he will revive Lorien indefinitely every time you kill him, unless you kill Lothric himself. In order to do that, you must aim for Lorien's back and actually put an effort to where you're rolling to and where you hit the boss from. Of course, you can also just kill Lorien again and again and slowly chip away at Lothric's health while he's on the ground reviving him. Overall, this boss is really good with its mechanics, though it shines most when it comes to visuals, music, lore, and overall just the feel of the fight, in which I think it's one of the best. Finally, after putting each of the cinders of the lords back at their thrones, you arrive at Kiln of the First Flame. There's nothing in this zone except a giant arena, and that's fine. The view and the wow factor it induces are enough for me. It's kind of too special for a moment to have anything else here, it'd be too much. The Soul of Cinder, while not my favorite boss in the whole game, definitely feels the most like a final boss. if we exclude that optional one of course, the Something King. Soul of Cinder actually wasn't that hard on Soul level 1, I still needed maybe 30 tries, but that honestly isn't that much compared to some other bosses. That's very weird because today he's probably the one boss which frustrates me the most. His attacks are just impossible to dodge, but that's fine at this point in the game since you have like 30 Estus flasks. However, that doesn't seem to happen with any of the DLC bosses, and that's odd. I used to chalk it up to, oh, I'm just getting greedy like with Lorien, but no. Sometimes you can't hit him even once between his different attacks, and I think that's bad, because it all depends on what the next attack is going to do, which you don't know. It mostly happens in the spear form though. What is that, you may ask? In the first phase, Soul of Cinder alternates between 4 different weapons. The first one is the sword he literally picks up from the bonfire. This is the second easiest form out of the 4 and it's still so difficult to constantly dodge these attacks, it's insane, they're all so delayed and oddly telegraphed. He has this one charging stab attack which, if you don't roll you get hit by, but if you roll you also get hit by it somehow. And since it's tracking you, it's really hard to roll away from as well. His super long wind-up slash is the one I love the most. I think the Bonfire Sword is ironically the most unique weapon, since it's unsafe to hit between his attacks, however you get a lot of opportunities to do so in between combos of all things. And excluding the charging stab attack, this weapon never feels unfair, even though it's fairly challenging. The staff form however, albeit still fair, is perhaps too fair and ultimately easy. It's too simple and almost impossible to die on. I think it encourages that run around and wait for the easy form mentality. The only thing that can actually kill you in a normal run, except getting hit by 5 magical attacks in a row, is the giant blue beam, though I don't recall a time where I've actually gotten hit by that. The spear phase on the other hand is pretty good, although I really believe there's something wrong with the hitboxes here, there has to be. They're so massive, it's ridiculous. One attack which really stands out as an exception is the double spin. I really like how, if you're near him when he starts it, it forces you to do the most perfect timed roll so as to be standing up for a single frame by the time he begins the second one, and then roll again immediately. I also really love the big spear thrust and pretty much every normal looking attack here, though he has one which I think is a little too much to react to, the one where he quickly stabs from the right. The curved sword form is my favorite, I think. It has this double slash flip attack which also requires you to roll twice in quick succession. Then there's the slower spin one, in which if you're very precise you can actually hit him in between the 2 slashes, though I don't think I have footage of it. He also does this, which doesn't do anything, but it's freaking awesome. Those are sadly the only notable attacks he does, and besides 1 or 2 others and the fireball he doesn't do much. This form also seems to last shorter than the other ones, which is a shame. The second stage however is amazing all around. Gwyn's team kicks in and surprise, he also does Gwyn's combo, which is really hard to get caught in and doesn't even deal that much, but it's still a great addition. If I had to criticize 2 of his attacks, one would be the leap, which I feel that he does too often and can be exploited at times. He does sometimes follow it up with an upward stab though, so I guess it can be risky. This is usually a bad addition, to only sometimes follow up attacks and have the player need to guess, not react, since they're so fast. But I think it's okay here, it discourages cheesy behavior. The grab attack on the other hand, he sometimes does up to 3 times in a row and can possibly do more, not sure if this is a bug or a feature. All else is pretty much a series of mixed up fast and delayed attacks, which seem unfair and daunting at first, but are ultimately very satisfying when you learn how to dodge them. Sadly, I think this boss is probably the only one which I like less today than I did when I first fought him. And although I don't believe he is the best conclusion to the base game, he is at least a challenging, worthy opponent. Next, I'll go over all the optional areas you might have missed. That's very likely to have happened if you were playing blind, as they are almost all hidden in incredibly amazing fashions. We should get Consumed King's Garden out of the way, as it doesn't fall into the aforementioned category of optional areas. It's simply accessed by walking left instead of forward after entering Lothric Castle. It's a very small area housing nothing but a couple of bus of men and cathedral knights, nothing special here really.
You ignorant slaves. Finally taken notice, have you? Of the power of my beloved Ocelot, child of dragons. Well, I will not give him up. For he is all that I have.
At the end of the garden lies Osiris, the Consumed King, who's easily the weirdest boss in the entire game. I mean, he's very easy, you have to screw up a lot to die on him, but he can also be very unpredictable at times. Most often it doesn't even feel like he's attacking you, but rather just thrashing around aimlessly like he always does and doesn't even know you're there until you kill him. On Soul Level 1, he was a pretty big challenge. I had around 25 tries before I got the better of him. By that I mean before I got lucky and had him not do his insta-kill undodgeable charge attack. Sometimes he just decides to dash forward without any wind-up, and if you're next to his body, you just die. This attack also comes up pretty often as he doesn't have that many others, just this thrashing combo and his spin, which is incredibly easy to dodge. Lore-wise, he's even more confusing. He has a son named Ocelot who he is apparently supposed to be holding, but he isn't there. He also smashes it into the ground, several times. Some people think they simply cut the model due to it being too disturbing, but the child continues to scream even after he murders it when transitioning to the second phase. Thus others have speculated that Osiris either murdered Ocelot before or he never even existed at all, with Osiris' insane self actually making the noises. But then again, why would he continue making them after apparently murdering him in his mind? Anyway, another optional area you can access after defeating Osiris are the Untended Graves, which are hidden behind an invisible wall. The Cemetery of Ash, the first area in the game, was this one but in the future. This is the version that exists in this world right now. It is a very small area once again, however that doesn't matter, as this is one of the rare instances where I'd say the area's boss defines the whole area entirely. That might just be because I like the boss so much, or more likely because it's such a small area that I don't even see it as an area, as there is another optional one with an even greater boss than this one, yet that area definitely feels way worse than this. Here, everything is completely shrouded, which obviously wouldn't have worked with a big and proper area, but it doesn't matter either way. Like I said, you aren't here for that. After venturing to exit the area, just as expected, you find him, Udex Gundyr, or rather Champion Gundyr, as he is known right now, still not having failed to link the fire as we witness would have happened in the future. This boss, despite being a simple reimagining of the first one in a late game image, is surprisingly great. This is what I meant when I said the Abyss Watchers could have been better if placed in the late game. Gundyr here just feels so powerful. He doesn't just fight you with his halberd, he punches you, he kicks you, he pushes you. The way he charges you head on with his red eyes in the second phase is genuinely scary to imagine. That, combined with his two leaping attacks, leaves almost no opportunity for healing, which is great. He's not some horrid monstrosity like almost every other boss in this game. He's just a fighter, and yet he manages to be one of the most terrifying enemies in the entire game. Nothing sums up the atmosphere and overall feel of this fight more than this sentence, which I don't remember where I read. Other bosses get some magical power in their second phase, Champion Gundyr just tries harder. But sadly, he's, well, kind of easy if you figured out parrying at this point of the game. However, it's probably the most satisfying fight to test your parry skills on, as he is, if fought otherwise, pretty damn difficult. On Soul Level 1, I had no more than 10 tries before I bested him. Here's another optional area. You remember breaking that bridge back in Catacombs of Carthus? Well, it turns out that you can use it as a ladder and descend down into the Smouldering Lake. I really love how well all these optional areas are hidden. Anyway, the Smouldering Lake is kind of beautiful in a way. It looks bland, sure, but it's just so expansive. I wonder how long I'm going to explore this zone. Sadly, it won't be long. This is an incredibly empty area. There's just a couple of Titanite shards lying around, which, might I add, are a very nice addition. I like that some players may stumble onto this place early on and possibly get way more overpowered than they should be. But besides that, there isn't much interesting stuff. Except Horus, of course, who's unfortunately gone hollow. There's also a giant ballista thing which you can actually climb up to and turn off. Amidst the vast lake emerges the Carthus Sandworm, a giant and menacing mini-boss starring a very anticlimactic fight. I know it's supposed to be a mini-boss, but still, it's so grand yet easy. He drops an undead bone shard and some spell. On the right is a bonfire which you can conveniently use for the following boss, the old Demon King. I think this guy is okay, but the fight is honestly on the boring side for me. I think he's way too slow. You can get up to 5 attacks in between some of his and during some of them, since if you just stand behind him there's nothing he can do, and if he gets you, you just run away and heal while he's standing there and doing nothing. Even if you go to him as soon as you can, which lots of people won't do, he's still way too easy and predictable. That being said, he's still pretty fun. I know this might sound ridiculous, but the sound he makes when you hit him is just really satisfying. However, this isn't all the area has to offer. From the bonfire you used for the boss, you can also descend down the stairs and enter the Old King's antechamber. Yeah, the zone actually has more to explore, and to be honest with you, I would have been better off if I hadn't found this place. This is easily the worst sub-area in the entire game. It's a complete chore to navigate and explore, and there isn't even anything interesting here, besides Knightslayer Zorik, who drops a badass greatsword. Otherwise, it's a painstakingly confusing, same-looking, boring-colored bullshit labyrinth. But not even a cool labyrinth where you find precious loot and unique and scary enemies and are then satisfied when you finally finish it. It just makes you go, thank god I never have to do this again. It's so bad I didn't even go there, so you won't be seeing footage of it in the video. I hate it so much in fact that I consider the whole entirety of the Smouldering Lake the worst area in the game, just because it's here. You might remember, after killing Osiris, to have encountered this odd and just annoying enemy you never see again throughout the whole game, and behind him you acquire some gesture titled Path of the Dragon. Probably some reference to a different Dark Souls I haven't played yet, is what I told myself and continued on my first rage-inducing journey. However, if you use the gesture next to a petrified corpse, who's sitting in the same position and overlooking some giant castle on the mountain in the distance, the screen fades in and this happens. This is easily my favorite secret in the entire game. The area itself, on the other hand, is far from my favorite. I actually think almost the entirety of it, excluding just one element, is an exception to the universal rule of Dark Souls 3 always feels good to play. I genuinely don't like being in this area, like at all. Every variety of the man serpents except the big one are really frustrating, look stupid and are a chore to fight. The dagger ones stun lock you and then leap back, and while you're getting up and going to attack them, they start slashing again and jump back before you can even get to hit them. The shielded ones just sit there and do nothing for 1 minute before doing some bullshit quarter-second attack and then cowering back for another minute. Then we have the rock lizards. I'm not even going to comment on this, I think the hate for them is universal. The first boss here is the Ancient Wyvern. By boss, I mean you have to run to a platform avoiding anything but the actual boss and then jump on its head and insta-kill it. This is the only exception in the entirety of Dark Souls 3, including DLCs, where I wouldn't be bothered if the boss was removed. I don't really like the Deacons, Wonir or Yorm, but at least you need to do something. Here you don't. You just have to run through these enemies and jump. It's just so stupid. I would skip it every single playthrough if it wasn't mandatory to progress the zone. And I wouldn't even come to this zone in fact if it wasn't for its second boss. This is the Nameless King, and I think he's probably my favorite boss from the base game. I'm really torn between him and Pontiff, but if somebody forced me to choose, I'd go with Nameless King. First of all, I really appreciate how cool the arena is, while also being very clean. Nothing here distracts or blocks my rolls, which I love. The first phase is here just to get you pumped up, as it's pretty easy. All of the Nameless King's attacks are very clearly telegraphed. The only one I have problem dodging is the big lightning slam, as it deals an AoE shockwave a little after his weapon lands, kind of like the giants, which makes it really hard to properly time. The phase is also surprisingly forgiving. I think you have to either be on your first couple of tries or really mess up in order to die here. He deals a lot of damage, sure, but it's not that hard to dodge, and even if you don't, he always gives you time to heal. The bird also gets staggered incredibly fast if you know what you're doing, which is nice for the returning players who just want to get to the second phase. The second phase is what's truly so great about this boss fight. I don't think he has a single attack here that doesn't get me really engaged. The wind waves he sends at you can sometimes be confused with normal attacks, which you draw backwards if you aren't sure you'll get to him and hit him in time. But if you do that with the waves, you'll get hit. You really have to pay attention to what he's doing. A lot of his attacks are also noticeably more delayed than every other boss I can think of, except Soul of Cinder. That's why this boss is one I still die to sometimes today, as it throws everything you think you know out the window. You also have to gauge whether he'll continue his combo at times, as a lot of his attacks look kind of similar and he has some that he actually varies. It reminds me of the final boss of the Ringed City DLC, which is really good, though I feel that it's even more detrimental in this fight. You have to decide whether to hit him or wait and see if he continues his attack. If you wait too much though, he might start his next one, and even if you don't have to do that, you still gotta decide if you wanna hit him once or twice. Of course, it's done in a way so you don't have to guess whether he'll do it, but wait and react. Almost everything else he does, however, is easy to dodge, but always really nerve-wracking at the same time since it deals so much damage. Take the lightning attack he sends from the sky as an example. It's pretty simple and I almost always dodge it, but if you don't, it takes like half your HP bar, even if you're embedded with 35 vigor. Same with the big lightning stab he does, which lifts you in the air and completely eviscerates your health. When I think about it now, I used to prefer Pontiff and maybe the Dancer over the Nameless King, but he's my favorite as of now, since it's the only fight from the base game that still gets me going. I think all of these optional areas are ultimately hidden for a reason. That reason is likely that, if you exclude the Nameless King and Champion Gundyr, you aren't missing much if you don't visit them. Exploration wise, all of these zones are really small as well. The little variety there could have been in each playthrough from visiting different optional areas isn't there now, as you won't be spending even an hour in some of these places. I guess you could at least say that it's better for these areas to be optional rather than mandatory. The two short segments that follow also apply to the DLCs, but I think it's better to put them here when it comes to the structure of the video as a little break from the big commentary. Some people might say that I critique the game too harshly, or I paint some things as phenomenal when they're simply okay. In other words, that I overplay things. But I really think that can't be further from the truth. In fact, the hardest thing so far with this video has been to not underplay things. And while this effort of mine to not underplay might result in some people getting that impression of overplaying instead, I still think I underplayed too much. By that I mean, while I do love Dark Souls 3 today, I don't love it as much as when I first played it. That's just how I am. Games do grow on me, but it's impossible to feel as ecstatic when exploring Irithyll the 7th time as it is the first time, and yet I really want to emphasize how great this game is to experience. There may even be some little details which I've forgotten by this point and take for granted. I mean, that's the reason why we always say things like, I wish I could play this for the first time again when it comes to all our favorite games, because it's never as good as the first time. On the other hand, it's also really hard to critique things which I'm at this point completely used to and have accepted as the reality of Dark Souls 3 that I can't do anything about, and thus don't even acknowledge. I've also commented a lot on the bonfires throughout this video, and I think I probably came off more negative than I intended. I mean, I do think a lot of bonfires in Dark Souls 3 are stupid, I really do, but it comes off way worse since I'm not going to mention every single good, and especially every single good enough bonfire. I won't go, this is a pretty good bonfire every single time there is one. I think it's intuitive to think that if I'm not mentioning it, then it's likely good enough. So I just comment on the ones which stand out. Another thing I mentioned often were shortcuts, and I think I had the chance to come off way better on that one. That's because shortcuts really stand out in this game, both when they are bad and also when they're great or simply good/okay, at least to me anyway. There's something satisfying about coming back to a place you've been at before, but that doesn't mean that any shortcut can do that. It actually has to work in the shortcut department as well. To me, the ones that I criticized are what seem like a poor attempt at bringing about that feeling, but in a very cheap way, and or giving some illusion of a greater level interconnectivity when there isn't one, or masking the world design's complete lack thereof. And it doesn't even work. It just brings us to some useless location and goes like, remember when you were here? Well, now you're here again, haha, everything is so connected. I would honestly prefer an elevator which takes 20 seconds to travel and changes directions 5 times, if it meant it'd drop me off at some place that's actually useful. Speaking of useful shortcuts, within the Cleansing Chapel appears a mysterious bearded man once you install the Ashes of Ariandel DLC. That was probably the most forced segue I'll ever do, but we'll roll with it. And now you've been transported to the painted world of Ariandel. The short trek you'll have through it will cost you $15 on Steam, and it's frankly some of the most overpriced video game content I can think of. I know it's about quality and not quantity, but the fact that this DLC has as many enemy types as most zones in the base game is just not a good look. So why not examine the quality at least? After emerging from the cave, we'll make acquaintance with the Farron followers, the so-called common enemies found within Ariandel. Thus, it's no surprise they aren't that interesting, and they don't need to be, especially since we usually fight them in groups. We then go after this item just to have the snow collapse beneath our feet and drop us off in a small, snowy forest. A pack of wolves surround us. Wolves are basically hounds if they were actually good enemies. This pack, however, seems to be infinite, which is just stupid. I like killing absolutely everything in this game, and the idea that I have to get out of this scary forest because I can never kill them all just rubs me the wrong way is all. That might be my toxic completionist mindset at play, but I disagree. Dark Souls is not some survival game or a simulator type thing such as Pathologic where you're supposed to think about your actions and not approach the game with a I need to make as many things happen as possible mentality. If something attacks me in this game, either it is dying or I am. If we go left to the forest, we encounter the tree women, which honestly seem like filler enemies to me, and the giant flies too, which are way more interesting. I really like these enemies from a visual design point of view. Same goes for the environment around them. Shortly after them, we arrive at a giant bridge. Another way to get here is going forward from the forest. There we get ambushed by the big bad wolf, who we cannot kill either as he simply disappears, though that's completely justified, you'll see later. There's also the Millwood Knights, which are some of the most imposing enemies in the entire game, period. Although the hit timings of their attacks are very off, I feel like. I recall several times where I was absolutely supposed to get hit, but I didn't. Their backstab hitboxes are also weird, but that might just be Dark Souls 3 as a whole. Either way, I find these guys quite fun to fight, as long as this doesn't happen. I don't think these are great enemies to fight multiples of, I really don't. Whichever of these small routes you choose, you'll end up at the bridge, which leads to the Ariandel Chapel. There lies Frida, who promptly tells you to GTFO. You obviously decide not to, and break her bridge before descending down upon it. Some more Millwood Knights snipe you as you try to get down from these giant roots, and I might die here, sometimes, but I really like how it's usually my fault. I didn't notice this the first time around, but it's amazing how a game such as Dark Souls makes the challenge of descending upon these routes feel so fair. Anyway, after finally stepping foot on the ice, you arrive at the first boss. And it's trash. This boss honestly made me realize that I don't hate the Crystal Sage or even the Deacons, I just mildly dislike them. This one I actually hate. A glorified NPC encounter followed by a fight with the big bad wolf, one with a severely underdeveloped attack list, which results in a lackluster fight that you'll likely die no more than once on your first playthrough. The end. Okay, let's get a little more serious. The fight starts off with you fighting the champion's Gravetender, who's surrounded by 3 wolves that you must kill every time you have to do the fight. The Gravetender is literally just an NPC, and I don't think that's even necessarily bad. The next boss in this DLC is complete proof of that. But the Gravetender is not a boss with flashy and interesting attacks. No, he is on the level of the one you meet on the Road of Sacrifices. Literally, just an NPC. After downing half his health, he summons the Gravetender Great Wolf, who I don't happen to hate as much as him. After killing the guy, you get to focus on what's supposed to be the real fight, and it's much better. The wolf looks absolutely awesome in my opinion, and his attacks are all great. His rush reminds me of Vort and is always menacing, he has this sideways lunge thingy, he has the double bite, and he also has a frost breath. But that's it. There's nothing else he does. I really think this fight could have been expanded upon and made actually interesting. The fight was also pretty hard on soul level 1, through health alone. I think I needed around 15 tries or so, though it made it none the more engaging unlike Aldrich. Overall, the way the wolf moves plants an idea of this beastly, ferocious boss fight in my head, just to then crush it with an unfinished encounter, which is, as long as we don't count the Ancient Wyvern, my least favorite one in the entire game. Then we return to the side of the bridge opposite the chapel and go down to the base of Ariandel. This means the champion's Gravetender area is completely optional, which is great. This final journey is when the DLC really picks up for me. We enter this ghastly, red-hued, infested part of Ariandel, which is a theme I already mentioned I really like. I think I even prefer it to Irithyll's theme, that's why it bugs me so much that it's so short. If there's one area I want to be expanded upon, it's this one. Here we meet our first Corvian Knight. It's one of 2 varieties and wields claw weapons. These guys are some of the best enemies in the entire game. I can't think of many I like as much as these ones. Their movesets are more fleshed out than the Gravetender fight. They are visually awesome, and I guess they're supposed to be some kind of assassins, which really suits their appearances. After reaching the next bonfire, we encounter another one, this time the rapier wielding variety, and I honestly can't decide which one I like better, even though their movesets are still very similar, despite the different weapons. I don't get the shit some people give these knights, especially the poise complaints. I think it's good to have enemies with high poise in DLCs. Most people will be coming here after completing the base game, at least I do, and that means you can perform like 6 or 7 attacks in a row with some weapons, which is downright ridiculous. I don't like when you're able to get a single hit on an enemy and that's it, it's over for them, you can just stun lock them until they're dead. Anyway, while these guys look just a little bigger than you, if they stood up, they would be like 4 meters tall, they're pretty huge, I think it's granted that they're hard to push. After ascending up a tower, you chase after this lizard and... Yes, I always forget that this happens, it's that good of a trap. Also, I'm not sure what he's supposed to be doing to you, but alright. We then get a second NPC fight before fighting through a bunch of wolves, Farron followers and Millwood knights. Nothing really special here. After that we descend into the infested with fly sewers, which I feel the need to mention look amazing one last time, because that was it. There's no more exploring to do. After turning the mechanism here, we return to the chapel and there's just one more boss to go. Besides one little area with 3 Millwood knights and a shiny item or 2 that I forgot to go on this playthrough, there is nothing else to see in Ariandel. The only secret I can think of is one invisible wall I believe was in the sewers that I forgot about, though I'm not even sure about that one. Even though the next and final boss took me the longest to beat the first time in the whole game, at the end it still made me go, that was it? I think elongation of playtime to difficulty only works to a certain extent, or at least it works better. It's way worse to have a chunk of content be expanded from literally 1 hour to maybe 6 hours than it is to have it go from 7 to 40. That's without mentioning this DLC costs only 4 times less than the base game while being maybe 7 times smaller and also, in my opinion, much worse. But that doesn't matter as we're judging this as art or something. Either way, it's roughly the same rate, 7 to 40, 1 to 6. Though I think the shorter, the worse this works as I said, but that's just my view on it. I don't think it's a very objective one, or at least not very factual. I think our mind often just loses track of time when playing something for a long while, thus we can't really comprehend its scale. But when something is just an hour long and gets stretched out to 6, I think it's pretty obvious, especially since the majority of that time will be spent on the next boss. After returning to the chapel, we find that the statue is gone and a secret path has opened up. Descending, we walk up to Father Ariandel, who calls for Frida.
Bring Frida to me, please. Canst thou not see the flame flickering once again? Soon will it surge. I can see it, feel it.
We have no need of thy flame. 'Tis only the flame quivering at misguided ash. Please avert thine eyes. I will snuff out these ashes for good.
Sister Frida's first phase feels quite minimalistic, but it's for a reason, you'll see. She has the double spin attack like Soul of Cinder, which I already mentioned I love. She also turns invisible and charges at you with her scythe, basically forcing you to panic roll and hope not to get hit by it. However, it is your fault if you don't see where she lands and don't get to her in time. It's very easy, you see the trail she leaves, you hear her, you spot the place she lands at by the little cloud that appears, you even have the objects she breaks. Either way, it's quite the underwhelming stage, but I like it. I don't think any other good boss manages to feel quite as human as this one. Speaking of that, this is the most NPC-esque fight in the whole game, besides Gravetender, and I think she shows that it can be executed well, and that not every boss has to have a unique model. After defeating her, we move on to phase 2. This phase begins with one of the most hype cutscenes in the whole game, though it's kind of ironic for how it's even more underwhelming. You basically run up to Father Ariandel, hit him until your stamina runs out or he does one of his fire spew attacks / Frida does one of her ice attacks. Rinse and repeat. Father Ariandel is a pretty cool enemy, but there's no real tension or difficulty in this phase, and I think it's the execution, as another fight in the second DLC with the same premise pulls it off a whole lot better. Anyway, that was it. Pretty boring, I know, but I'm pretty good at this game by this point. It looks way easier than it actually is. Oh wait, what? Very cheeky from Software, very cheeky. That's right, the tutorial is over. We're in the third phase now, a third HP bar to down, and if we die, it's all over. I know I said the first two phases are underwhelming, but I think this very much justifies the first one. The second is still kind of boring though, in my opinion at least. This phase, however, isn't. It's very easy to lose focus, screw up and die in this stage. If you don't manage your stamina, you'll just get wrecked by her combos, which are all ridiculously long. And the fight will be very long as well if you play it safe, which in the end allows for even more errors on your part, and I feel the need to mention this again, going back to the first phase once more. Because of that, I think this is the most stressful boss in the entire game. It's even more stressful when you're forced to remember so many attacks. I constantly find myself repeating, don't forget the little black flame that shoots after the big one, don't forget she sometimes continues her combo with the long jump. Her lunging grab attack is also very badass, though I don't have footage of it, it's super easy to roll through. If I had to criticize one thing about this phase, it'd probably be the frost attacks. I think she does them too often, and most of the time doesn't leave any opportunity for attacks. You have to roll back and wait for a different one, which prolongs the fight a lot. Though I guess that might be the point. Still, sometimes it's literally impossible as she stands in the ice, which is bad. And that was the DLC. I'm kind of on the fence about it. On one hand, I did enjoy it, I thought it was good and I don't regret playing it. On the other hand, I don't think Dark Souls 3 would lose much if it didn't have the entirety of this DLC excluding Frida, who I like a lot. To me, the rest is just one pretty big area or two small ones, which isn't enough for a damn DLC. The first boss is, like I said, my second least favorite one out of all of them. And while the second one is great, in no way does it justify the length of a whole DLC. And to be honest with you, I've had my fair share of Ariandel and I don't plan on revisiting it for quite a while. The opposite can be said for the Ringed City. I know I told you that I judge these games as art, and I do all the time, except when I'm making remarks about them product-wise obviously, which I still think are important to at least mention and include. The Ringed City costs as much as Ashes of Ariandel, and it has more than double the content and way better quality in my opinion. If you look at it in one particular lens, it's even better than the base game I think, and by quite the margin. If you agree with me that one of the boss fights here doesn't really count as a boss fight, but rather PvP content, then that means 3 out of 3 bosses here are all phenomenal, with 2 of them being the best bosses in Dark Souls 3, period. I like to think that the reason all these bosses are so great is either chance or the pressure of releasing the last chunk of Dark Souls content ever, and not that From Software only now perfected the art of designing bosses, as that makes it all the more bitter knowing that it's over. First, we need to return to the Ariandel Chapel so we can get transported to the Lothric Heap, the first part of this DLC. We immediately start off with some high drops that deal no damage, which is kind of a theme within the whole DLC, especially for the first part, as we are slowly descending to the Lothric Heap. I don't think this descending has much of a, I guess, theme as much as a level like High Wall of Lothric does, though I still like it. The first enemies we encounter here are the Mercmen, and they begin the trend of how unique a lot of enemies in this DLC are. The normal ones are usual fodder, they can also grab. The mage variety is way more interesting. They have a simple dodgeable spell they can throw at you, but they can also morph into Great Soul Dregs, which are these invincible dark spirits that charge at you and will probably scare the shit out of you. You really gotta pay attention, if not for your character's sake then at least for your heart's. Going left, we encounter a Herald Knight, which is another enemy I really like. Their attacks are so bullshit delayed, but it makes sense when wielding such a giant sword. Swinging it one direction will cause you to stagger back and have to regain your posture before you begin your next slash. After defeating the knight, we get an Iron Giant, yet harmless plunge, which at this point doesn't really make sense to me. You'll probably have your first heart attack with a Soul Drake here if you don't manage to kill the mage. You also get your first taste of the Angels, an enemy I'll speak more about later. This one doesn't really do much here as you get behind cover immediately. 2 overgrown Lothric Knights will be encountered here, and I really enjoyed their little fight. You have to watch out for the shielded one which stands at the back whilst fighting the aggressive sword one. I did have a problem with the shielded one though. I'm not sure whether it's exclusive to these overgrown knights or the normal ones as well, but the shielded guy gives you almost no time to hit back after an attack, which is really annoying. I believe I would have noticed this present in the normal ones, but perhaps not. Quickly thereafter, we also learn that killing these disgusting slug enemies gets rid of the angels they are controlling. Then a pillar collapses as we approach it, and you can actually use it as a bridge, which I just love so much. I wish they had done more stuff like this in the game, if not for shortcuts, then at least for secrets, like this. We drop once again to a small swamp overlooked by angels, and here they get really serious. The idea is great, I think. You're in a swamp, which means you get poisoned, but you also have to take your time and hide behind cover. But if you do too long, you also get cursed by the angels, and you have to look around and find the pilgrims to get rid of the angels and walk the route safely. There are long bouts of time where you get exposed to the angels, but I think it's what makes the area so oppressive. You also have a bonfire really close by anyway. After taking a small plunge from the swamp, we arrive at another bonfire, from which we take what is probably the biggest plunge of all. Here we fight the twin demons, the demon in pain and the demon from below. These two assholes are the fight I spend the most time with in this DLC, and does feel like I can talk about for hours. And yet I also feel like I'm walking on eggshells here because of my hatred for them. You see, this boss is an absolute nightmare on Soul Level 1. I've probably died near 100 times on it, no joke. According to the wiki, you would need to hit it around 80 times with the weapon I had, but it felt like at least 100 to me. I'm not kidding when I say I'll probably get a panic attack if I have to fight this boss again. I don't even think I'll be able to play Doom anymore. Jokes aside, this fight was probably some of the most nerve-wracking, exhilarating gameplay in the entirety of Dark Souls 3. Every single little mistake can result in an insta-kill. Just the act of dodging a simple attack is a life or death situation. It can send you back to the first phase, which, if you get angry enough, you might not even be able to get through for a couple of tries. That first phase is definitely the most well executed double boss fight in the entire game. At first you have one melee boss and a ranged one, just rolling under the melee one and completely decimating him is easy enough, but you also have to watch out for the trail the other one sends out, which makes you get out from under him. And if you're too close to the ranged one, he'll start being really aggressive too, which is a nice addition, though sometimes the ranged one decides to just be an asshole and run up to you, which is really dumb. Then you have a slight point where the ranged one turns melee, but the original also remains so. Then the transition times overlap in such a way that you get two ranged ones. Being aggressive has a very high risk and a very high reward in this fight, as the demons can get staggered and riposted, but if you go too hard, you run out of stamina and get beat up. After killing one of them, the other turns permanently melee, which is a nice moment to let out your frustration and prepare you for the second phase, in which you'll be fighting just one. Their movesets are different depending on which one you killed first. I'll comment on the laser one, the version when you kill the demon in pain first, as that's the one I fought on my most recent and my Soul Level 1 playthrough, and I don't remember the fireball one very well. I'm pretty sure only one attack changes however, and I probably wouldn't have had that much to say about it anyway. So, phase 2, the Demon Prince. I don't know if I developed some kind of Stockholm syndrome for this boss, but I genuinely love this phase. Even on Soul Level 1 it never even felt unfair. It wasn't like, why is this game doing this to me, but rather, why am I doing this to myself? That being said, it still has its flaws of course. The camera here is easily the worst it ever gets in this game. Some might say, well, you're not supposed to lock onto every single enemy, and I would agree as I said earlier. If the lock-on wasn't as useful as it is in this fight. It's very hard to keep track of the demon, he's very agile. This problem is made larger by the stone ruins lying all over the arena, which serve a cool visual purpose as they get toppled by the demons, but they're ultimately annoying when you run into them and they spin your camera around and get you killed. He does a lot of big AoE attacks in this phase, so they'll be gone soon enough. Thus, it's more prevalent in the first phase, but more detrimental when it does happen in this one. The boss also has some questionable hitboxes with his right hand overhead slam attack, and by questionable I mean inconsistent, since none of the other hitboxes seem to extend so far to the back of his arm. Besides that, I think the hitboxes here are great. It's not like Void where you get hit though you shouldn't, which incentivizes you to not stay under him. Here, the ranged one scares you off in the first phase and he simply leaps off in the second, thus you can't really just stay under him. Then there's the big laser beam. I just don't get this attack, I'm sorry, it makes no sense to me. I have no idea how they made it so if you roll you don't get hit, even if you become vulnerable for a short while, but sometimes it just decides to hit you. Not a fan of attacks like these that look like they tick 10 times a second, but it's really once every 2 seconds. I do think it's a scary and cool moment at first, but quickly becomes annoying. His jump back and slam attack is one of the most surprising ones in the game and remains just as stressful on every try for me. I love how precisely you have to roll to avoid it as well. This one is awesome too, even if it's too easy to dodge. The small fire trail he does on some melee attacks makes sure you don't space out and generally have it too easy in the prolonged periods where he just spams melee, as it would otherwise be as simple as fighting one demon in the first phase. Overall, I actually like this boss, and I like the Lothric Keep as well. If this zone was part of the base game, I wouldn't question it, though what follows is largely better. The winged beasts carry us to the ringed city, where we get greeted by a Judicator. The Judicators are giants that spawn in vulnerable armies of archers or occasionally a spinning knight. I really like the placement of this one, it works very well. You have to hide behind the tombstones from the archers, then slowly make your way to the Judicator and kill him. If you do so, you get some hitherto unreachable loot. You can completely skip this guy if you want to, though he also drops the Divine Blessing, which is quite useful. The little wall you can walk along here really pushes the idea of ambushes in this DLC. We get another bonfire, after which we encounter this cursed variety of the ringed city hollows. They just curse you if you stand too close. You can't dodge the ability, you just have to wait it out. I really don't like this idea, I think it's silly. Luckily, we also encounter a sword-bearing ringed knight. These guys are some of the best enemies in the game, and definitely the most visually appealing. They literally look like some fan art, I love it. The fight feels like an actual boss, it's like a little soul of Cinder. Like figuratively, they do the same combo. The hollow clerics you encounter afterwards are also nice, though they are a nightmare until you learn how to kick them and get them out of the turtle position. You meet a spear-holding ringed knight as well. I tend to think the sword ones just look more badass, though another reason I prefer them is this attack the spear one does. It literally has no build up and looks like he ended his combo, there is no way to react to this one. 5 Herald Knights block us from what follows after. You can plunge them or run past. Here lies the most creative swamp in the whole game, which also happens to not poison or slow you. Curious. The theme here is curse, and it's pretty appealing. It's infested with the creepy locusts, which are nothing special to fight really, though I love how their sticking out heads are supposed to resemble shiny items. Either that, or I'm just blind. Here's also the second of 3 Judicator encounters, and it's sadly not that great. He just sits in the middle of the swamp with no blind spots for his bow dudes. I really think they could have done some very creative stuff with blind spots and the archers like the first encounter. We also find the most unlikely enemy in this location, the Dragon Slayer armor, which I guess fell here and became reanimated. I'm not sure if this is exclusive to this fight or also present in the real one, but I only noticed it here. He sometimes follows his leap attack with a shield slam and sometimes not. I know I mentioned I like this with Soul of Cinder, but here you can't really wait and see if he does it. It's too fast, so you just have to guess, or not fight back at all after the leap. It also has no distinct pattern, like he only does it if you're close. If it only happens here, then I guess it's fine. I think I would have definitely noticed it present in the real fight. You also get his armor, which looks awesome. On the outskirts of the swamp, you get to fight some more ringed knights, which is a win in my book. There's also an encounter with 2 of them, 1 spear and 1 sword, though I think this fight is, if not bad, then at least just not for me. I don't believe these are the best enemies to fight 2 of. The Lothric Knights were great, as the spear one just stands back. The ringed knights on the other hand are extremely aggressive and have already hard to pin down movesets. Make them overlap and I think it becomes more of a panic roll fiasco than a challenging and fun fight, but that might just be me. Others may like it, and they're totally optional anyway. You don't even have to run away from them and thus feel guilty, you can simply sneak by. Afterwards, we make our way through a large bridge as a suspiciously great model dragon is firing down upon us. We then enter some kind of large tower and make our way downwards. The only notable thing inside is a chest whose chain is conveniently hidden, and surprise, it's a mimic. I don't know why, but this idea is very funny to me, imagining my character poking at the chest with a sword, anticipating a reaction. After navigating the at first confusing tower, we arrive at a bonfire, thereafter encountering the Dark Dragon once again, in the form of a mini-boss. I really like this fight and I think they could have done a lot more with it. A few tweaks here and there and it could have become a proper boss fight. Jokes aside, I gotta spoil this one for you in order to comment on it. He does appear in the form of a boss later. In the boss fight, you are very highly encouraged to hit his head, both for making it easier on yourself as it deals double damage, and also to actually have fun with the fight. Here, however, his head hangs just a little above where your character will be able to reach most of the time, which is very annoying. You defeat him with a riposte and he falls down to his supposed death, without giving you any souls. After that, we arrive at an elevator that leads us to a shortcut back to the second bonfire of the Ringed City area. If we roll into the little opening, however, we find ourselves in a room with an ember and an invisible wall, which once revealed, lets us descend down this ladder. I don't think this is that intricately hidden, especially considering the dragon mini-boss dropped no souls. That matters because when taking another giant plunge, we fall into a giant arena, now stuck with him, Dark Eater Midir. But before that, I feel the need to comment on how you get to the boss. The path to Midir's arena from the bonfire is cool and all, but it gets pretty annoying if you die a lot, since you have to wait for the elevator each time, and on top of that, go down a long ladder, which is completely unjustified. How many people do you think will be coming back instead of taking the plunge? They could have replaced the ladder with a big plunge instead, and I don't think anyone would have complained. This might be seen as nitpicky, but I really do think it's a problem. It's not like I'm running past a horde of enemies like with other bosses. There's no difficulty or engagement. I'm just waiting, and that's boring. Back to Midir though. There are 3 major reasons for why I think Dark Eater Midir is the best boss fight in Dark Souls 3, and generally one of my favorites in any game ever. The first one is, I guess, the aesthetics. I don't know how to describe it, how the boss looks, how it moves, how it sounds, the soundtrack it has. This is obviously completely subjective, as some people might not appreciate his song as much as I do, his model as much as I do, and so on. Beauty is subjective, though I think most Dark Souls fans generally seek the same thing in this regard. I especially like the countless moments while fighting Midir where I would somehow end up behind him and have a moment to marvel at just how huge this motherfucker is. It made me actually worry about how I'm going to kill him. I can't explain it. His deformed head, his eyeless face, the torn sides of his mouth, the holes in his wings, it all just works so well. The animation team obviously didn't hold out either on this boss. I can't decide whether Midir or the final boss of this DLC are best in that department. The second reason is difficulty and balance. This boss obviously has very high damage and HP, with the latter being the highest in the whole game in fact. And yet, even while fighting him on soul level 1, where almost every single attack of his one-shots me and I had to hit him, I believe, almost 80 times, I don't think I ever screamed out unfair, even when I got angry. While he does have lots of HP, it's incredibly surprising when you get really good at fighting him and realize just how much you can hit him. Even on soul level 1 I felt like I was getting away with too much. And although you sometimes don't get a single hit in, you almost always can get 3 or 4 if you're near his head when he ends his attacks. Obviously, that's with the Astora Straightsword, which was my choice for soul level 1. Lots of other weapons will be slower. The boss has such a great skill curve on soul level 1, and I imagine a normal run for some people as well. And I'm not trying to sound condescending or anything, the boss was hard enough as it is for me too, just not as ridiculous as soul level 1. Today, if I could exclude just one attack, the big laser, I honestly think I can dodge for about 10 minutes before I mess up and get hit if I really focused on it. There were only 2 reasons for why he was any amount of difficult on soul level 1. One of them is universal to almost any boss across the game. It's the fact that it's really hard to learn attack patterns on soul level 1 if you've forgotten them, as you always die when you mess up, so by default you need to die like literally 40 times in order to memorize and figure out everything about the boss. Especially one as diverse as Midir. You might also need to learn new stuff you didn't need to before, as you could simply get away with lots of mistakes. In my attempts, I could literally see how I was getting closer to beating him by eliminating different attacks. I started getting to the second phase every time after realizing I had to dodge left to avoid the opening attack. I learned to dodge the humanities, which got me even closer, and finally I got kind of decent at dodging the big and final laser attack, after which it was only a matter of 5 runs or so before I beat him. There really wasn't anything skill related barring me, just knowledge. I truly believe I can do it consistently now on Soul Level 1, and by that I mean in less than 10 tries. The reason I said kind of decent for the laser... What the fuck? The reason I said kind of decent for the laser attack is because it's the second reason for why he was so hard. I really don't believe most people have the reaction time for this. I certainly don't. I panic roll every single time I see it. It might be because I get really stressed about it, but I still think it's a little too much. I happen to dodge it in this video, but trust me, it's a rare occurrence. Going back to the diversity of the boss, in my, I would say, 35 tries at most on Soul Level 1, there were 2 attacks which I actually saw only a couple of times. One of them is the breathing fire forward, then stopping, and then breathing fire forward again. He usually breathes it from the side after his head tilts a little, which is an animation that was completely indistinguishable from what he does when he breathes it forward, so there was literally no way for me to react. I only saw this once. Another one is the left and right slam and then breathing fire down. The fire down attack is one he usually uses separately, and I only saw it used in quick succession as such once as well. The only other attack I can think of, rather than the big laser that I had a problem with, is the one which he stops moving for a second then suddenly charges forward really fast. I actually like this attack a lot. It's easy to react to if you expect it, but I think it takes you out of the flow of the fight when you end up behind him and have to run for 10 seconds before you get to his head. It doesn't pose much challenge, but you have to wait is all. Finally, the third reason for why I love this boss is because he's just fun. There's something about spacing out from reality, getting serious and proceeding to dodge and hit for 3 minutes straight in such a smooth way. Besides the big charge I mentioned, the fight never slows down until mid-air or you die. This is kind of tied to balance, as I think the fact he's so fun is the reason he gets away with so much HP. There are lots of other fights I can think of, even ones which I like, that would be worse off with this much health. Other examples of it being a good addition is the Nameless King and the final fight of the Ringed City. I heard some people voice complaints about his camera, and I honestly don't see it. Well, I see the boss, actually more than I expected to in Dark Souls. I'd go as far as to say that the lock-on camera here is really good, for such a flailing around boss that is. The only times I didn't know what was going on is when I was under him, which was usually my fault and something you shouldn't do in this fight. I honestly can't wait to replay the game on Soul Level 1 in a year or probably 2 when I'm craving this game again, and especially to fight this boss. I really love him. We should probably get to the last and final boss, however. If we use the elevator as intended, we face off against the final variety of Ringed Knight in this DLC, the twin great sword wielding one, who also happens to be the final boss. Okay, he isn't, but he might as well be with how awesome this guy is. I'm 99.9% sure this isn't even a serious enemy, but rather a mock on how ridiculous some weapons and enemies can be in Dark Souls. Either way, it's welcome in my opinion, especially since you actually get his swords. After him, we get what you might call a boss fight, but it's PvP content in my opinion. You face off against another player that gets summoned in your world, that's it. I'm not going to comment on it as I don't play PvP in Dark Souls, though I'll say it's kind of odd to gate the final content of the DLC with a PvP fight, which is otherwise just a simple NPC one if you play offline. Before getting to the final boss, I'll make my last commentary on the levels up until now. I don't like the Drake Heap as much as the rest of the DLC, though I still appreciate it for what it is. I like the vertical layout it has, even if it does feel way more forced than High Wall of Lothric, where it seems more natural. Here we just drop down and take no damage until we're at the bottom, although I do appreciate just how much it's vertical. I guess you could say it pushes the idea of how ruined the Drake Heap is, how destroyed and untraversable it has become. When it comes to the Ringed City, I don't have much good or bad to say about its layout. Nothing really stands out to me here. I enjoyed the more linear trek to the swamp, which was one of the only ones in Dark Souls 3 that was enjoyable to explore, while still having that oppressive vibe and being challenging. What I love most about the Ringed City area is just how phenomenal it looks. It's one of my favorites alongside Ariandel and Irithyll. The slight yellow hue really does wonders here for Dark Souls is still impressive, yet at times obviously repetitive and bland visuals. Speaking for the entire DLC as a whole, I also love how perfectly spaced out the bonfires were, and the shortcuts, while always very much expected, were otherwise great and useful. We should probably wrap up this DLC for now though. After the PvP fight, we ride upon an elevator and walk up the stairs to meet Filianor. We touch the crumbling objects she is holding and see this cutscene. Yup, we just ruined absolutely everything. The giant sea of ash that's left contains nothing besides the second greatsword Ringed Knight and an NPC fight. Walking up to the pygmies' thrones, we see this. This is Slave Knight Gale. Yes, the same Gale from Ashes of Ariandel, who's now come to murder and consume the dark souls of the pygmies for his lady's painting. The last one he needs is yours. Gale is a runner-up to Midir for my favorite boss in Dark Souls 3. From a visual standpoint, he looks pretty much perfect, a more beastly, inhuman form for his first phase than a robust, powerful stance in the second. The special effects in this fight were just cranked up to 100. The flying red souls, the lightning, his cape's trail, this thing he does, which is the most badass shit ever. I don't think any boss in this game feels as important as the player character, just as much as Gale does. I mean, you're technically the last two people left in the world, excluding that Ring Knight and NPC of course. I do love the idea, by the way, the two last people in the world fighting in the middle of nowhere. The final fight isn't some terrifying monster, but just a man. His soundtrack is also my favorite in the whole game. I think it matches the fight perfectly. From a gameplay perspective though, we have a lot more than that to talk about. The first phase is pretty underwhelming. Nothing is really hard to dodge after observing it for a couple of tries, unless you get too greedy and hit him 4 times in between each attack, which I might do, sometimes. This lack of difficulty is very understandable, as the phase is only 1/3 of the actual fight, and it's very nice to get that insane rabbit phase out of the way before we get to the real fight. But that is kind of bad too, getting it out of the way. The phase doesn't feel polished enough, it's not as challenging as the rest of the fight. That sucks because I really like the theme of this phase, the let loose angry gale. I think they could have done a lot with longer, harder to dodge combos like Midir has, but I'll stop here with the comparisons as there are two completely different types of enemies. This is kind of similar to Frida's phases, but not really, since Frida's third phase is an improvement on the first more bland one in every single way, but Gale's second and third phases are both better and also way more different, not really the same as this one. The second phase on the other hand is absolutely great. The now composed Gale shoots his crossbow at you, throws miracles, his damn cape leaves trails that actually deal damage, which I love so much. It adds this second layer of the fight that makes it harder, yet is also not detrimental to always be perfect about. If you dodge the main attack, the sword, you take a little bit of damage. If you dodge both of them perfectly, you take none. It also forces you to think about where you are dodging, not just when. It's like the Abyss Watcher's second phase. Something else which made the fight more engaging is gauging whether Gale's going to continue his combos and when he isn't. Sometimes he does a stab, sometimes it's a stab and a spin, and there is literally no way to know. Some people might hate this since it makes it feel like we can truly learn all of the boss's patterns, but I disagree. Gale doesn't have that many attacks, and it's a skill in and of itself to be able to improvise and make decisions when stressed out. It makes the fight more challenging in a very unique way, which is always good. You get just enough time to see whether he'll continue and also attack, every single time. The third phase on the other hand is when it gets real. All of these red souls or whatever they are fly everywhere, and while they do seem annoying at first, especially for a soul level 1 run, I can't recall ever getting hit by more than one, even while I'm fighting Gale in the thick of them. They make the fight more disoriented in a way, but it's not really annoying per se. In this phase the varying combos also get removed, which I like. It's like seeing the boss in two different lights at the same time, and it allows for far more complex and difficult to dodge attacks. It is however one of the contributing reasons for why the third phase is ironically easier than the second, at least for me. He also stops using his crossbow and even his miracles. Once you can pin down every attack of his, it's pretty hard to mess up here. The one thing which I feel is a great idea but sometimes feels bullshit is the lightning. It forces you to pay more attention to your surroundings in an otherwise large and open area, which I love, though when it strikes behind you and you can't see it, it's just plain unfair. You probably won't expect me to do this since I hardly do it with any other bosses in this game, but I'll have to make an exception for the last one. I really think this fight is way too easy. If you can get through the second stage, which isn't even that hard, there isn't anything that can consistently kill you after a couple of tries. I not only remember him being significantly easier than Midir, Pontiff, Frida and Nameless King in my first playthrough, but he was also a total joke on my soul level 1 run as well. I managed to beat him on my 7th attempt, and I had probably fought him like 2 times in the last year. 7 attempts sounds like a lot, but really isn't, considering how long the fight takes. I died at least 7 times on almost all other bosses. That includes Deacons, Wonir, Gravetender and so on. Just let that sink in. When it comes to the harder bosses, I approached 100 deaths on the Dancer and more importantly, the Twin Demons, which are from this very DLC. Going back to Gale, I believe his attacks are too easy to pinpoint, which should be, by this point, even for those who've only played Dark Souls 3, the only thing that's truly challenging, most of the time anyway. I don't believe many players will have issues with executing rolls and dodges on many bosses, like almost ever. The real challenge is remembering attack patterns and not panicking and panic rolling. Some people might say, well, he's supposed to be on the border of really hard and just easy enough, so it feels like you're actually fighting a normal man, as it should be. No. Others might say Midir is supposed to be the real last boss of Dark Souls 3, and I disagree, considering that, lore-wise, he doesn't even exist by the time you get to fight Gale, whether you killed him or not. Also, I don't think you'll get that many improvements in skill this late in the game, and especially not that much more powerful by leveling. But otherwise, this is my favorite boss from a design standpoint, and I wouldn't question you if you dubbed him as your favorite instead of Midir. But I believe for the final boss of the last DLC of the third and final Dark Souls game, he's just too easy. And for now, that's it when it comes to Dark Souls. We obviously have a possible sequel to Bloodborne and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, which I'll probably make a video on soon. Concerning Dark Souls, the series is over, and I think we ended on a very high note. The Ringed City is some of the best times I've had in Dark Souls 3, and I might even say we ended on the highest note we've had so far in the third game. We talked on and on about the technicalities of it all, but I'd like to take a more feels approach in this segment. This is the most fun part of Dark Souls 3 for me, and the one I most anticipate on every single one of my playthroughs, and that's just how I feel. I don't think this DLC would have worked as well if part of the base game as it does in the form of a DLC. It feels very different from the base game, and thus almost like a slightly different take on the formula. It's an almost surreal experience I can't really formulate into words. Perhaps it's because it's the end of it all and I'm just getting too deep into it. I'm not sure really, but we should probably leave it at that. It's just how I feel about it. Finally, I should probably give my explanation for that why does Dark Souls feel perfect even if we know it isn't phenomenon I mentioned earlier, which was the reason I even wrote this long video. The nature of Dark Souls 3 is to be extremely satisfying if you're good, but also extremely frustrating if you're not. There is no debating it. No matter who you are, getting hit always feels way worse than it should. It forces you to man up, get good and trek on through the challenges. And that's great. Only feeling relieved after defeating a boss fight or otherwise hard challenge, as in being glad that you never have to do it again because it was so painful, is something I consider bad. But feeling both relieved and satisfied, like you do in Dark Souls 3, is way better than just satisfied. It makes the game feel more alive in that way. But some people bring up Git Gud way too often, and I'm not talking about the other people, I'm talking about the frustrated people themselves. I know because I was one of those people. I used to confuse frustration caused by difficulty with that caused by bad game design. And in some ways you could say that's my fault, seeing as I'm very stubborn and overall just a sore loser. I yell out stuff such as "this game's trash" whenever I die as an instinct. That's just how I am, and so when it's actually trash, I dismiss it, every single time, even if it's true. I realized this whenever I started writing this video and thought to myself, what frustrating thing would I label bad in this game? And I couldn't find a single answer. Are Crystal Sage and Wolnir badly designed RNG boss fights, and is the Great Wood made artificially harder by adding extra enemies? Come on, who dies on those? They're the easiest boss in the game, just get good. Do you die sometimes because of unfair attacks? It only feels unfair because you're bad, just get good. Are Farron Keep and the Antechamber bad zones which are simply hard because they're impossible to navigate? Just get good. You get the point. Now, I do think Get Good is a funny meme, but bringing it up as defense for any criticism levied towards the game is silly in my opinion. And that was it for the Dark Souls 3 commentary and critique. I really hope you enjoyed it, though I guess that's kind of granted if you made it to the end. I wrote this 26,000 word script in 10 days, but don't expect videos this long that often, unless I really love the game I'm talking about, as is the case here. I'm not sure whether the Sekiro video will be happening soon or sometime in the future, but I'll get around to it eventually. As always, subscribe if you like this type of content and want to see more of it. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next video.